and team, we are almost there. We're almost there. And why do we have a fantastic session to end on for our Responsible Raw Materials 2021 annual conference, during which we have looked at a massive array of tools, tips, tricks, techniques, and approaches that can be used across all different aspects of raw materials to make ESG, or environment, social, and governance, a reality, rather than just something that we all like to talk about. So how do we actually make it real? Over the course of the week, and we'll be doing a proper summary when we get to the end of this session, we have heard from, or we will have heard from 81 speakers from all over the world who have spoken to us through 73 different talks, which isn't bad, is it, Rose, given that we've only been organising this over the last month or so, but I think it just goes to show the power of everybody coming together in this virtual world, which is really exciting. Obviously, COVID has been and continues to be horrific for lots and lots of people around the world, but we always need to look for the opportunities that might present ourselves, even when times are really difficult. Just in terms of where people have been dialing in from during the course of the week, here is the map. So we're really excited to see such a wide scope in terms of geographies. If anybody knows anybody in any of those countries that aren't coloured in dark green, feel free to get them to dial in now, and then we can colour in their country on the map. No, absolutely not. This is not an exercise in trying to colour in that map whatsoever. But that was something that was really exciting, I think, wasn't it, Rose, when we took a look at that information late last night, which was great. So we've been absolutely so privileged over the course of this week to hear from some phenomenal speakers. I think for me, one of the highlights was actually our Bursting the Bubble session, which we had on Wednesday morning. So if any of you missed that slot, that was when we invited some very, very brave individuals to come and talk to us about what they thought mining and raw materials, etc., was all about. So they gave us real insight as to what people outside of this space that many of us work in day to day really think about the likes of mining. If you want to go and find any of those talks, the team behind the scenes have been truly phenomenal, especially because this is just a volunteer organisation. We're a not-for-profit. Everything is being run for free with an aim to get as much cross-sharing and learning as possible. If you want to go and see any of those talks that we've had during the course of the week, just go to our website. And what you will see here is you can either go to the conference page by clicking that button there for the 2021 conference, or at the top of the page, of course, we've got the usual tabs. Go into there and you'll be able to see things like the link to the YouTube channel. We've got the infographic that is gently being updated behind the scenes with all of the different stakeholders and also tools and techniques that we've been exploring this week. Of course, we have the schedule, and we're now into that Friday morning slot, which is brilliant. Finally, we've still got, I think we are almost out of space on those training courses, but if anybody really wants to come on one of those training courses, which are free to attend, please email ellen@satala.com to find out more about that. Just with regards to those talks that I was mentioning, you can either click on the abstract, so by clicking this little button here, or another way into it is go into learning material and talks. And in there, you've got all of the different talks from the past 12 months that we have had within the organisation. And you can see actually the first one that pops up here is the Bursting the Bubble panel. So if I just click on that little button here, you can see there is some background wordage that tells you about what went on in that talk, and then that edited video itself. So you can hear what all of our fabulous speakers had to say for themselves. With regards to all of this, everything is nicely searchable. So just click on the little search button there, type in either the name of the presenter or something to do with the title that you're looking for, and you should be able to find those talks. Or, for example, if you're really keen on learning more about artisanal and small scale mining, or ASM, click on that button. And there we have a collation of some of the talks from this year and last year that go into that topic area. And what you can see here is, for example, lots of these are being watched by university students who are trying to better understand what artisanal and small scale mining is all about, and also professionals who need to understand more about it as well. These are all freely available to be made use of in any which way you would like. So really, really exciting. It is absolutely fabulous, the variety really in talks that we've had during the course of this week. This morning, we're going to kick off with satellites. We heard a little bit about satellites and using data that comes from space yesterday, but Gareth Morgan is going to give us an update off the back of last year. So we're going to go to Gareth very shortly. We're then going to travel to Malawi. We're going to have Elevin, who's going to give us an insight from her perspectives with regards to transforming Malawi's low value stones into $1 million. So if you haven't already tuned into that, go and get your colleagues to tune in, as it were, because that's going to be a fabulous talk. We then go to Francesca, and Francesca, I just love the title of your talk. It is Brittany Goes to the DRC. Okay, I'm wondering if we're going to have some Brittany music or some Brittany moves. We'll find out. She's saying no, Sarah, absolutely not. Okay, so we're going from Malawi to the DRC. We then go into the world of biodiversity. So we've been very heavy on the social side this week, which is fabulous. There are so many great tools that we've heard about. We're then going to dive into the world of biodiversity with Andy Purvis and then Veer. Veer, earlier on this morning, we had slight problems with his sound. So hopefully we will be able to hear his very deep voice. If he begins to sound a bit like a chipmunk, don't worry, we do have a backup plan for that. But in the interim, you might see Rose and I laughing slightly because we've had some fun with that this morning, haven't we, Veer? But in all seriousness, Veer is going to be talking about biodiversity and building on another talk that we had last year, which looks at DNA-based methods for really trying to understand what's going on in an ecosystem. We then got Louis Machon from the OECD, followed by Jamie Strauss from Digby, who I see has just dialed in. Jamie has done huge amounts of work over the last year, putting in place the mechanism and the ability to bring together junior mining companies, but actually it's a tool that can be used for any organization to ascertain how are they doing in terms of ESG, and using the Digby platform to allow investors and other interested parties to ascertain what's going on in that ESG space for those mining companies. And then finally, we come out into Jeff Townsend and Kirsty Benham, who are the co-founders of the Critical Minerals Association. They've done huge amounts of work with the British Parliament, but also other governments over the course of the last year. A very new organisation, but I think it's actually primarily thanks to them that the politicians in the UK, and we heard from one of our members of Parliament yesterday morning, Alexander Stafford, it's thanks to Kirsty and Jeff that perhaps parliamentarians are really talking about raw materials in the UK. And then finally, we end with Dr. Dan Smith, who's going to help us wrap it up and take a look at common ground in sustainability hot topics. So a really exciting lineup for this morning. And without further ado, I'm going to go straight to Dr. Gareth Morgan, who is the founder and CEO of Terabotics. We heard from him last year, so if you haven't watched his video, go and check it out now. And the reason why we've asked Gareth back is because we often get asked about his video and how do you use this space-derived data, etc. And because last year, Gareth showed us how Earth observation and remote sensing satellite technology can play a fantastic role in providing the much needed independent and objective measuring and reporting for ESG metrics, not just within mining, but across the whole raw materials value chain. And Gareth, I know you've got some slides up already. I just wondered if you wanted to give us an update on what's changed over the last year, and what can we maybe expect from this really exciting world.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, and good to join you all again. I'm just sharing up actually something from last year to give you a recap. But the key thing to highlight, I think, is the fact that we have this problem of self-reporting, solely relying on self-reporting thus far with ESG metrics for the community. And Earth observation data, as I particularly highlighted last time, gives us this kind of key extra tool to provide objective, independent verification of self-reporting. And that's what I'm showing here is from last year, a program we worked on, which was to verify tailings dams locations from what has been self-reported, self-disclosed by corporates. and then we see actually what is the reality, and that gives us this kind of unique global independent objective tool which is provided by satellite remote sensing. And that's really kind of unique in that sense, amongst other sensing tools, to be able to give us something to check and balance against what we currently use as a majority for ESG reporting. So I'd like to share a little bit more and talk a little bit more about what's new, what's developing, and how things are growing in this space. So got a few slides, but the key point is there's a lot of satellites. There's a lot of capability that has blown up in the last few years. Earth observation satellites. It's really a trend of just sensors, low-cost sensor technology that might be IoT sensors deployed on the ground, but also in space. The cost of deploying these things has plummeted, and the capabilities have exploded and grown. So we have a lot of sensing, a lot of data, and something again I shared last year was to show that we can observe anywhere in the world with this data. No borders, no boundaries. We have a lot of data, and that's growing all the time. New satellites, imaging satellites, thermal sensing satellites, emissions, gas emissions satellites and sensors. The capability is growing. So the key thing though is that's a lot of data. There's a lot of observation capability, but so what? How do we turn that into something useful for the ESG community, into a toolbox, the subject of this session? So you've got to be able to turn it into some sort of metrics, something that's actually usable and something that can be actioned by ESG analysts, etc., financial analysts, and investors, anyone looking to assess the performance of the industry. And that's particularly the sort of things we're working on with the European Space Agency, for example. I'm just showing a program we're working on, big program, and that's has the objective and the mission to shine a light on the oil and gas and energy sector using satellite technology to be able to create new unique observation points that weren't there before, but also create more timely data, so you can see things instead of waiting months, whole quarters, whole years to hear back from self-reporting and company reports. We can see data weekly, daily in some cases, and so picking key points along supply chains, along oil and gas supply chain, and then replicate the same blueprint along mining supply chain. There's a lot of capabilities. There's a lot of satellites mentioned there. Images, photographs you've seen, but radar, thermal imaging, gas sensing, huge amount of capability that's growing. So to turn it into metrics is the key thing, and that's really the focus, is we've got to make it useful. We've got to make it into something that we can actually consume, use, and pass on to end users without having to worry about these satellites and space assets there, and how do you actually connect to that data. So turning that into data feeds is one thing, but then turning it into actually true reporting. So I'm just going to show a couple of examples of flaring monitoring, for instance, using thermal satellites. One example is being able to monitor anywhere in the world where there's natural gas flaring being done by the oil and gas industry, or any refineries, smelters, anywhere where they're flaring gas. Surprisingly, happens a lot in a surprising number of industries and sectors. But particularly, we're looking at probably the most active place in the world, which is West Texas in the Permian Basin, which is the home of the fracking boom. The flaring activity dropped last year, of course, with COVID going, but then is back on the rise again, and we see that on a daily basis, but that reporting hasn't come out yet necessarily to show that this year it's up again. It's not yet disclosed. So we have near real-time observations to check against disclosures, but we also get them early as well, so we can take action, and stakeholders can take action. And it's this is another example of reporting, basically satellite observations turned into reporting. So tracking oil and gas wells being constructed, built, where they are in their production. Just highlight here the blue little charts here show basically early reporting from satellites versus disclosed reporting in the orange, which is always lagging by a couple of months or underreported until it eventually catches up. So that's really the key and the nub of it, of getting the satellite data, being able to turn it into reporting metrics.
Fantastic. And so, I mean, I think with this, Gareth, I mean, what you're showing here is that you can utilize this data, and I'm going to ask you in a second how available these data sets are. Is it something that anybody can get their hands on, or where does this data actually come from in the first place? So you take this data, and then the real trick is turning it into something that's usable. I guess working with people who truly understand what they're looking at as well. So yesterday we heard from some fantastic social scientists saying, yep, they can buddy up with people such as yourselves and say, okay, what are we actually looking at on the ground? What is real in terms of what we're looking at? So just to come back to that original question, and actually, so Jamie Strauss has posed it to us through the panel. He's asking, all this raw information as well as the analysis provided sounds incredibly expensive, and of course incredibly difficult. Can you give some color as to the accessibility of this information, which would be appropriate for, say, small but as well as large companies?
Yeah, so that's the point really of creating, sort of reducing everything down to a sort of report. Like the satellite data is strange, exotic raw materials, essentially digital raw materials, and it's like the ingredients of a cake. We bring it together and create it into something that can actually be consumed and used. Like this is a weekly report you'd receive in your email, for instance, so it can be as a feed into another software. And so the trick is to take all of that raw information, turn it and convert it into environmental metrics, social tracking, urban expansion around mine sites, etc. All these sorts of applications, but it's got to be seen right through to the end, and then reported in something digestible, affordable, and useful and actionable. So and often the data sources are free. Actually, the European Space Agency, that slide I showed earlier, spent billions of dollars, euros on many satellites over the last few years, and that data is all public access, but you've got to be able to consume it and use it. So at the moment it bottlenecks into a small group of experts really who can and scientists and engineers who can do something with that data. We've got to get it out to the broad market.
So that, I mean, I think that's perhaps one of the big developments that we've seen over the last few years. It's big organizations actually paying for the hardware, as it were. So launching all of those satellites, etc., into space, and then the industry that's growing behind it is that interpretation of that data. And one of the themes or the questions that has been coming gently through the conference is greenwashing, of course, is one of our big fears, because actually we want to look at what is reality. And is that something that these kind of data sets and this sort of interpretation can help say, well, what's real rather than just greenwashing?
Yeah, that's it. Spot on. Exactly. You get accusations of greenwashing to the corporates, but also to the ESG analysts who accept the reporting or pose the requirements to report X, and then say, great, well done, pat on the back to us and you and yourselves, done, move on. Well, hang on, let's check it. This is like CCTV essentially, but we've got to tell it, we've got to analyze it as well. It's complicated data, but this is a way to check things. So showing, for instance, emissions data from satellite, very new satellites, global, almost daily repeat, to measure methane, direct measurements of methane, not just calculating what a company thinks it's producing. And we work with a lot of corporates themselves to provide this information, because if you're running an oil and gas facility, you're not sensing and measuring by default what's coming off your facility. You're calculating what's coming off and modeling that and saying, well, I ran the generator, the equipment for X number of time, and the manufacturer specification said it might leak this by standard, and this is what I report. Well, what's happening in reality? So this gives us a chance to check that, and also then check companies are doing what they say they're going to do to reduce emissions, rather than just saying, we replace the equipment with some new equipment, and therefore that should reduce the emissions. Well, let's see, let's find out.
So it's measuring reality rather than trying to calculate what you think might be there instead. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Fantastic. So I think, I mean, with this, there's so much more, Gareth, that I'm sure you could be showing us here in terms of that change detection, looking at changes through time, and also helping us to step outside of, say, those mine sites or whatever the case might be, and say, well, what's going on in the broader context? So in that ecosystem round about that mine site, be it with regards to people, but also the environment and the biodiversity as well, which tees us up really, really nicely for the talks that we're going to go into later on this morning. I could just leave you running your slides all day, Gareth, because I know that you've got all of these fantastic graphics and images, etc., etc. So it's absolutely brilliant. But ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the fantastic Gareth Morgan. Thank you very much, Gareth. Great.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. And hopefully Gareth will stick around and be able to answer any questions that you might have for him in the chat or in the Q&A, and then also on YouTube as well. So we are receiving comments, etc., coming in through YouTube as well. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to move straight on to our next speaker this morning, and it gives me fantastic pleasure to welcome to the stage from the wonderful Malawi, Elevin. Now, Elevin, if you want to start sharing your slides and finding that mute button. As you can see here, Elevin is going to talk to us about transforming Malawi's low-value stones into $1 million. And so here we have supporting the Malawi women for value addition of gemstones. Elevin, I'm going to pass straight to you for you to introduce yourself and then get cracking with your talk. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Sarah, can you confirm that you can see my screen?
We can indeed. It looks perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I am Elivin. I have two surnames, Nkonjera and Chawinga, but we're not going to my surnames. I am here to represent Nyasa Mining Cooperative, where I am the General Secretary. And just a brief background of Nyasa Mining Cooperative. It's a cooperative, or it's a grouping of people that are in the mining business, small-scale mining business in Malawi, interested mainly in gemstones. And the association or the cooperative, it supports its members to sustainably mine the stones, as well as to process in a bit of value addition and also marketing. So it's just a grouping that we formed a few years ago, and we're trying to see where we can go with this. And on the other hand, you can see the logo of Australian Award. It's because I'm one of the scholars, Australian Award scholars. I participated in the short course that was in 2018. So that's where I got an interest to look at gemstones. How can we add value to our gemstones? And now this attracts my topic, or this is what caused me to come up with this topic of transforming the low value stones into $1 million. And to begin with, why I thought of that topic, I look at my country, Malawi. It's considered as one of the poorest, the poorest countries in the world. And whenever I sit, I ask myself that, why is it that we're poor? Is it true that we're poor? How can we move out of this situation? So one of the areas where I got my answer is that indeed, we are not poor. We have quite a number of minerals. As you can see on the screen, Malawi has a number of mineral resources. We have uranium, we have coal, we have limestone, which is mainly, these are actually industrial minerals, very important for construction of the country, or for the construction phase of the country. And these are actually minerals that can first be used in Malawi, and excess can also be exported to other countries where there's need. And we also have a lot of gemstones in Malawi. But why is it that we are poor? We are poor because if you look on this slide, on your left, we export raw materials. We export the unprocessed stones, unprocessed gemstones. If you look at rose quartz, clear quartz, or even the one that I'm holding in my hand now, this is clear quartz. The way it is just a stone, a low value stone. And this is the one that we've been exporting for a long time to China and a number of other countries. What does that result into? It results into exportation of what? Of jobs. As a result, most Malawians are not employed. We export value, because if you export a product that has not been processed, you sell it at a lower price, and even the taxes that the government get from that, it's very, very low. But the very same stone, if you were to add value, then it would be looking the way it's looking now on our right, that we can do quite a number of things. So my question is, should we always, send something 1,000 miles away for it to be processed? Can the same thing be done just in country? So since 2017, these are the questions that I've been asking myself. And as much as I have other jobs, I do other jobs, this is still draws my passion, and hence making this presentation today. So in the next slide, I'm just going to take you through what I have been doing since 2018. What have we really been doing to make sure that we don't continue to export jobs? In the first photo, the one where you can see a lady wearing a golf shirt, a red golf shirt, that's me. That was actually in the field. So the first thing is, let's mine responsibly. Can we stop people? Can we stop people from mining? The answer is no, you can't stop, but we can support to mine sustainably. So this was a meeting with me, some of the miners in the field, just to see how do they do the mining, what how is the environment, what else can we do? So from this visit, we had actually a training now for women. So that's the second photo, a training for women where we're looking at how do they recognize the potential stone? What do they do with those stones? And these are women that were already mining. So we actually engaged the right people, the ones that are already in mining, looking at what are the gaps, what are the things that they need to consider if they are to mine sustainably. So I'll also mention that this one, we also did it together with Nzimba Gemstone Association, and Nzimba Mining Cooperative. You can find them on LinkedIn. So from the initial discussions that we had, it was mainly like taking them through the basic gemology, responsible mining, responsible sourcing, and all that. And the next thing, we identified a few women that we also engaged them in value addition, or in cutting and processing of stones. So my ask was, apart from teaching them the basic gemology, we also have to know how to process these stones. How do we stop exporting the jobs that I mentioned earlier on? And second, and in the fourth photo, the lady that you can see wearing a green wrap, a green cloth, she is one of the women. She's one of the top women miners in Malawi. She owns over 3 mines. Her name is Margaret Nkoma, and she actually loves spreading her news. She's one of the women that has really inspired me. And indeed, she's one of the women that has been exporting raw stones. But together we've experienced that, so what can we do? Is there something that can be done for us to move out of this? So I personally, with my interest and also with the support from the Nyasa Mining Cooperative, we procured just a few equipments. And these are the equipments that you can see on the second line of my presentation, the first photo on the left, on my left. That's actually banded amethyst. In its raw context, it looks like that. To be honest, it's not attractive. You can't sell to someone and say that, oh no, I have bought a stone. And it's actually the one that I'm also carrying in here. I don't know if it's clear, but yeah, it's this one. It's not attractive. But the same process, I put it in the machine, a preforming machine, and immediately you can see the third photo. I know it's not very visible, but then you can actually see the change, that the very same stones now they're looking far much better. And we have even went a step further now to put them in gift bags, gift boxes. The one that you can see on the fourth photo, and it's also the one that I'm carrying here with some gemstones inside. So for this processed stone, at least we can sell for $15 or $14 per package. Same thing that if you can see on the first photo, the unprocessed one, you sell that for less than $1 and sometimes 50 cents. So if we are able to do this at small scale, what if we empower more people to do this kind of work? How much is the Malawi going to benefit as a country in terms of the tax collection, as well as also for creation of jobs for so many women, youth, and the majority that are now jobless, that they're trying to find ways of surviving. So my point is, as developing countries, we do have the opportunity to transform our economy, but we are not fully utilizing it. How can we best utilize this, or how can we get there whilst we're also thinking of responsible mining? So in my last slide is just to show a few equipments that we have been using. This is equipment that cost less than $2,000 just to be able to do this at a small scale. But now it's mainly like a case study, giving a case to the government, giving a case to the development partners, giving a case to individuals, even the business people, that don't you see this as an opportunity? Can't we do something on the ground? And with with the pandemic, with the pandemic coronavirus, people are facing so many economic challenges. Maybe this can be the first answer to this, the first solution to this. So I really try to be on time. The first photo, that's also me. And I have my support system. That's my son, who was just watching and observing what I'm doing. And I hope I'm creating a future geologist, and he's going to love stones as well. So thank you so much for your attention. This is what I had to share today.
Fantastic, Elivin. That is absolutely brilliant. Massive round of applause from all of us on the other side of our muted microphones. That is fantastic. And yes, I too hope that you have a budding geologist in the making there, in the form of your son. It's brilliant. So just with regards to some questions for you, there's lots of lovely questions coming in on both chat and in the Q&A. And Ludovine asks, she says that she really likes the fact that this initiative combines direct training with some formalization and, of course, transparent commercialization. What is the government's support or response to this?
Okay. Of late, we have actually observed the government now getting interested. I'll say that in the past 4, 5 years, even 3 years, the government was more interested in large-scale mining because they didn't have trust on the small-scale mining. They felt like it's a sector that is uncoordinated. But with now coming up with a few cooperatives, associations, the government has seen the potential of the sector. So now, actually, last week, the president announced the government's interest to support the small-scale mining. So we are proving a point. Now the government is getting interested.
Fantastic. That's really, really exciting. And yeah, Ludovine is there clapping, going woohoo. And another point here that's come in from Jane, and she's asking about the investment side with regards to this. And obviously you mentioned that some of the equipment you've got costs less than $2,000 per piece of equipment. Is this something, I mean, would you want investment from either other large companies or from the government or anything, or is this something that you're building up yourself?
Okay, no, actually, it's something that would also want investment from large-scale companies, but basically to go in partnership with the small-scale miners. And the reason is because they're trying to promote or to enhance, to support the small-scale miners. So it's something that actually has to be done with the multi-stakeholder approach. One, the government enabling the policies. Two, the private sector being willing to invest together with the locals so that together we uplift. So, and the civil society, of course, advocating for the responsible sourcing and environmental sustainability.
Brilliant. And so I guess what this means is, so when you're mining the raw stones, the areas that you're mining from, are you in close proximity to any large scale mining, or are you totally separate from large scale mining?
Okay, most of the places where the gemstones are being mined, they are separate from the large-scale mining companies. And maybe just to mention that please make me correct, some of the Chinese investors took advantage of this by engaging or partnering with the locals, where they are just the license holders, but they're not really benefiting from the process. So it was still the Chinese mining the raw materials and exporting them to China. So that's what we're trying to kill, that don't just take advantage, but rather let's do it collaboratively, whereby maybe you have clearly defined terms and you know that there's a win-win situation for both the locals as well as the investors that are coming in. So we're really focusing more on responsible sourcing of the raw materials as well as the mining aspect.
And so following on that train of thought, in terms of that responsible sourcing, Elivin, so you mentioned that if you're selling one of the raw stones, that could be, less than $1.50 in terms of what you get from it. But if you then process it, or you've got that beneficiation up until that finished product, you're then getting $20, which is a very nice margin. Do you think that because you're doing it in country, is there an additional value add in terms of the fact that it's yourselves doing that? Because you see this sometimes in different gemstones as well, in terms of the provenance of them. Actually, if you can prove that provenance, there's an additional value on top. Are you seeing any of that?
Yes, I actually can see a very strong value to that. Basically, because, okay, now everyone is talking about doing something responsibly and in the right way. So it's something that we have collected. We have actually added value to it. If we export it at that stage, like if I was to sell it for $50, for 50 cents, obviously government tax was very, very little. But now with just selling at $15, the government will be able to get a bigger allocation. And from that allocation, the government can also actually invest part of the royalties that they're collecting from this back into the environment, now making environmental sustainability and also promoting economic development of the country. So I see a lot of value by adding this, by adding the values or by doing the value addition in country. Just apart from job creation, I feel like there are so many other opportunities.
No, it's fantastic.
Stop being called the poorest country in the world.
And of course, this is something where, where it's the women that are being trained to do this and doing it. Is this because women are better than men, or is it because it's just different skill sets, or the men are off doing something else? And I say that with a wink.
Okay, no, I fully understand. No, it's a sector that has both men and women, dominated by men, but it also creates opportunities for women. So we're saying that let's do something different, something unusual. And actually, if you go on the grassroots, you see that there are indeed so many women that are supporting, but now when it comes to the level where you're now marketing the stones, the men will dominate. So most men in Malawi, it's either they are doing the physical work of mining the stones, or if not, they are facilitating the selling of the stones, even though that stone has been mined by a woman or was processed by a woman. So we are also trying to look at how best can we create opportunities for women economic empowerment. But also it's a sector where women do face, women who have actually championed the sector, they also do face gender-based violence. So how do we also come in with the knowledge or with information on eradicating gender-based violence in the sector?
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely fantastic in terms of what you're doing here. A few more questions, if I may, and they are coming in thick and fast in the Q&A and everything, which is great. Just in terms of the ownership structure. So you mentioned that, say, some Chinese companies had come in and actually were using the owners of the land to get access to that. In Malawi, can land be owned by men and women, or is it something that the rights are predominantly owned by men, or how does that work?
Okay, so actually now we have a law which supports land ownership for both men and women. You can either choose to do it joint ownership if you are a couple, if you're a family, or you can also choose to register in the name of you as a woman or as a man. There are no restrictions.
Good, that's fantastic, because it's not always the case.
Some people have also misused it because some have married women in order for them now to have access to land. So
I'm going to move swiftly on from that to one final question. That is terrible. This question comes from Richard Harrington, and he says, "Hi, Elvin, really, really interesting, and thank you for your talk. Have you stimulated a local jewelry industry as well as obviously selling internationally? And so, do you have the local jewelry that's coming from this, or is it something that everything is actually being exported?"
Okay, so we're actually in the process of doing that. We have started doing at small scale. Like I have my colleagues in the Nyasa Mining Cooperative. A ring that I'm wearing here, it was given by one of my colleagues who is in the Nyasa Mining Cooperative. So as a cooperative, we do have some people that have gone advanced of making jewelry and selling it locally as well as exporting. And there is a website called Virtue Gem. I don't know how many have visited it, but they do market stones from Africa, particularly Malawi, Zambia are the direct beneficiaries of that. So we also do place our products on that website. But I want to be honest that we have started at a smaller scale, but we're hoping to expand or to grow.
Brilliant. So you have in part answered my final question, and maybe if you could take that website link and put it into chat, that would be brilliant, because I'm sure everybody would be really interested to have a look. Final question is there anything that we as that international community could be doing to support you, other than, of course, buying your products?
Oh, okay. Yes. Actually, as I said, that this needs to be done like in a multi-stakeholder approach in order to support. We have these associations and these cooperatives, but who are still in need of knowledge, especially on the responsible sourcing. on how to be safe on environment, geo information, like even the previous presentation, I think it was fantastic. You'd also want people to have that knowledge that in the areas maybe where they're exploring, what are the chances of finding the gemstones that they want, or maybe what the mine lifespan. And so in terms of knowledge, yes, in terms of investment, we would actually welcome people coming to support in the investment aspects, like the private sector engagement, and even in lessons learned. So there are quite a number of areas. And I know that there are also people that have experience in other countries doing the very same things that have supported Zambia. So if the same support can also come to Malawi, like to this association, that would be fantastic. And yeah, maybe by any chance there would be a company that produces or that makes equipment. There's also opportunity that maybe you can partner and then to see how best we can have a win-win situation towards that. Like we are able to process the gemstones using the machinery that they are producing. So I open up that yes, support is needed from the international communities, apart from buying, marketing, and knowledge. Thank you.
Fantastic, Elvin. So please do put your details into the chat, because I'm pretty sure you're going to get some people contacting you with some ideas, etc. So thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for the wonderful Elvin. That was brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, staying with Africa, we're going to move from Malawi to the Democratic Republic of Congo and to the wonderful Francesca. And you heard Elvin talk about that relationship between small-scale mining and large-scale mining. Francesca and myself, we met one another a couple of years ago now in the DRC on one of those large-scale mines. And for those of you that dialed in early, you'll have seen Francesca and Ellen waving at one another, because the last time they saw one another was on this particular operation. Francesca, if you've got some there's anything you want to share, you've got your mute button off, which is brilliant. I'm going to pass across to you for you to tell your story of Brittany goes to the DRC. Off you go, Francesca.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm so happy to be with you today, and actually very happy to speak after Elvin, because this topic is very close to my heart, and I'm very happy to share my experience from another perspective. As Sarah said, me and her team had a chance to meet each other during my previous role. And I'm very happy to share what I experienced as a sustainability professional in the mining sector in DRC. As she also pointed out, I named my extract and section in a very particular way, making references to Britney Spears and her song. This is because basically during my 8 years in DRC, so from 2012 to 2020, I had friends all over the world, and we were all making different experiences. So we used to motivate each other and support each other by sharing songs about Britney Spears and her performances. So I wanted to share this personal touch and perspective with you as well today. So to start, to give a little bit of context, my love story with DRC is pretty long. So I started to go into the country and work in the country during my university years in 2006. I used to work with an NGO based in Lubumbashi, which is in the southern part of Haut-Katanga now. And I was working basically on community development and development programs with the communities. In 2012, I had the opportunity to be recruited as a CSR advisor for 2 mining companies, large-scale mining companies, in Kolwezi, which was another side of this province. This felt both familiar and new at the same time. So familiar because I knew the country, I knew the context, I knew the culture, but the perspective was completely changed. So now I was working for commercial business for a mining company, and I needed to adapt to that. I'm not sure how many know DRC and that particular region. So I put a little bit of a map in my abstract just to give you a visual description of the area. So when I arrived, Kolwezi was a very small mining town, fully dependent on Gécamines operations. Gécamines was the national mining company at the time, and all the communities that operators needed to deal with were former mining townships where ex-employees from Gécamines were housed and were provided water, electricity, healthcare, and education, with all the relative consequences for legacy issues, but also expectations on new investors and new companies. The landscape of Kolwezi changed completely in 5-6 years. So with the boom of the economic sector, and the mining sector especially, and also the demand for copper and cobalt, the town changed completely. So it went way beyond the historical limits of the town and completely canceling any difference between urban and rural areas. These had two main effects. So one side, the communities changed a lot due to urbanization rates, but also the demographics of the communities changed because we had the population increasing 5 times in 5 years. So we passed from like 200,000 people to 1 million and more in the last years of my staying there. These were all people attracted by the mining sector and all the opportunities that this might offer, both directly and indirectly. And they settled in these historical communities, changing a lot, not just the demographics, but also the way mining operators were dealing with that. So it changed the interest, it changed the expectation, and in some sort of sense, it created also conflict within the communities that the mining operators needed to take in consideration when engaging with the communities and deciding the engagement strategy and the development strategy. At the same time, this process was accompanied by a change in governance. In 2016, DRC went through a process of decentralization, de facto increasing the number of provinces in the country. What this meant for Kolwezi. So Kolwezi passed from being a peripheral mining town in the huge Katanga province to become the capital of a new province, Lualaba, which basically became the economic center of the province because it housed many of the mining operators in the area. So Kolwezi really became the place to be. So every operators, stakeholders, clients, customers flooded Kolwezi over the years just to understand what the mining sector was, both large-scale mining and artisanal mining, and also to understand what the opportunities were. To link it to the initial question of Sarah, so how do you make ESGs real in this context? I think for us, the turning point was the 2018 mining code. Most of people focused on the tax aspect and the fiscal aspect, but this new code was really a turning point for all the mining operators, also for when it came to stakeholders engagement, resettlement, and community development, since this new law integrated lots of international standards and best practices around it. If you can see from the map, I mean, all the communities were encroached into different mining operators. So before the 2018 mining code, each mining company was dealing with the communities directly, both in terms of impacts management and community development. This framework changed after 2018. So government had much more visibility on what the mining companies were doing and really wanted to play that role of supervision and coordination, not just in terms of tax and revenues, but also in how money from community funds were spent, how the negotiations with the communities were carried out, and also how the different mines needed to assess and manage their impacts. With the new mining code, civil society really focused also on educating the communities, which was really positive, because at that time, the communities were able to understand what their rights were and what the legal framework was and what the mining companies needed to do, which put them in a stronger position in dealing with different mining operators at different type of mindsets. I think for me, one iconic example that can summarize all these changes and how the mining sector changed in the DRC with the relative effects is artisanal mining in the cobalt sector. I think for us on the ground, there was something that we call the before and the after the 2016 Amnesty International report. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that, but basically it's a report concerning the cobalt industry in DRC and all the concerns around human rights, transparency, and corruption. If I can say before 2016, it's not like artisanal mining was not existing, it existed, but it had a different type of characteristics. So mostly it was considered as a way to gain as much money as possible to repay debts, to repay school fees, to repay medical care. and it was basically poverty driven. At that time, there were not enough artisanal mining concession. Most of the peoples were working on Jekamin old tailing dams, and there were some kind of interactions with large-scale mining, which were predominantly dealt through security or community development or community engagement. This changed, as I said, after 2016, both for the economic rise of interest on copper and cobalt, but also because the attention that Amnesty International put on these all due diligence and human rights concerns. As for the sector, I mean, it attracted lots of people from different parts of the country and the province, which were not necessarily driven by poverty concerns, but really saw in this sector a way to improve themselves, good economic opportunity, and a way to make a good and sustainable living. This shift of perspective change also from one side the approach of the government, and definitely demanded mining operators to change what their approach was. Obviously, the government was from one side pressurized to protect large-scale mining from intrusion and from violent interactions with mining companies. But on the other side, they had the responsibility to provide access and resources to artisanal miners to being able to perform their activities and actually make that economic and social transition to development. But when it comes to mining operators, I think that, I mean, and I can just talk from my experience, and Sarah and Ellen knows, it's a tough discussion to have internally because you have different interests, you have people that see the matter and intend the matter in a different way. You have the legal approach, you have the community approach, you have the environmental approach, and you have the governance approach. So all these souls and parts need to find a way to dialogue together and definitely shape a more integrated approach. Security and community are just first base, a reactive approach, but ASM, especially in that area, is there to stay. So obviously an approach that takes in consideration all these perspective needs to be developed. When I spoke to Sarah about this talk and what the final question should have been, she asked me, what does it mean for you, like a responsible cobalt? How would you define that? I think I will answer by mentioning one of my recent talks with one economic professor that is very traditional. So it just looks at the curve of demand and the curve of supply and makes an assessment. So I asked him about cobalt and how he would see these in the long term, considering supply, due diligence, and human rights. And he looked at me and he was like, oh, don't worry. I mean, the market will substitute cobalt as soon as the resources start depleting or becoming limited or difficult to access. And I was like, what about the people then? And he looked at me like, well, didn't really know what to say. And I think that's a little bit what the situation is now. I think in the past 3-4 years, lots of efforts have been put in formalizing the sector and making it more responsible, both from a governmental point of view, but also from large-scale operators and third parties and development organization. I think the real challenge now is to make it sustainable for people. So keep that promise that artisanal mining can be a viable job opportunity and a way to develop from an economic and social point of view. And you can do that not just in the short and medium term by making artisanal mining a viable supplier, a reputable supplier for cobalt users and customers, but also to find its place in the whole economic framework of the country in the long term. So.
Francesca, that was absolutely fantastic.
I hope I respected my time.
It was beautiful. It was perfect. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the Francesca. There we go. Fantastic Francesca. Round of applause. Oh, brilliant. So Francesca, I mean, with regards to this, I have to say, I had no idea that you'd lived through so much change, like when you were there living in the Katanga and then the Lualaba Indaba region within the DRC. Just with regards to the 2018 mining code, so when that came in, it sounds like that was a massive change in terms of how different groups of people actually interacted. You don't need to answer this directly, but do you think that that 2018 code ultimately was a good thing, or did it hamper things? Was it a bad thing?
I think it's a good thing, meaning that the first mining code was in 2002, and that was really at the beginning of the democratic life of DRC, where they didn't really know what the perspective of the mining sector was. So I think the 2018 mining code takes in all the experience of those 16 years and really basically translates and says, okay, this is the strategy of the country. We wanted the mining sector to be the driver of the economic development of the country. Of course, a law without implementation and without governance doesn't really, cannot by itself translate the letters to actions. So I think the big challenge is more like in the governance around the mining code and how all those different obligations and requirements are implemented from a fiscal point of view and a community point of view. I mean, that's, and in my case, if that is going to be done, it's going to be it's going to put DRC in a good direction.
Yeah, no, brilliant. And I guess then, and with that as well, so you've got, you know, the government, I guess, sort of increasing that governance, as it were, from their angle. As you mentioned, we're also seeing increasing scrutiny, quite rightly so, from the buyers of cobalt and other materials from that particular region. And at the moment, there seem to be a never-ending array of responsible cobalts, et cetera, et cetera. Again, I mean, obviously everybody is moving in the same direction and trying to improve things. Do you think, though, that the kind of the sheer array of requirements is quite confusing, or like, how do you know which one to choose, etc.?
I think, the explosion of all these framework audits requests and all these kind of protocols developed by customers and clients, it's quite confusing. It can be very challenging and heavy also for mining operators. Sometimes you find yourself having 3 audits in the same kind of period, and they ask you the same thing just in different ways. So it's kind of difficult to keep up. Obviously, what you choose is really depends on the type of operators that you are. You can be like bare minimum, just respecting what the laws requires. If you're a Western group, obviously you need to comply with what your customers, and in this case, like the European Union, requires. So it really depends on operators. So it requires a lot of work, but I think we are not at that stage yet. So we are not in the stage where everybody really feels comfortable to adopt a more of a common ground. Everybody's more having this one-to-one approach, which makes them more comfortable.
Okay, so at the moment we're still on that one-to-one relationship, which I guess creates a huge amount of work for the people who are having to provide all of that information, but then at least you're building that trust, I guess, with the buyers. Yeah,
the level of comfort when you know that cobalt is safe to use.
Yeah, so I guess that's something as well, because we've discussed a lot this week. Yeah, how do you streamline that and make it easier for the operators to provide that data and that information? But actually, if you do that, you miss out on that trust aspect. So that's a really brilliant point. Another question here is, obviously there are many different strategies in terms of that interaction or that engagement, perhaps between large scale mining and then the artisanal and small scale mining, especially when they meet. Because of course, from a geological aspect, the rock is where it happens to be in the ground, and that's what we're all trying to get to. I don't know if you have any comments on the diversity, I guess, with different strategies that are out there, trying to say, okay, what is the most responsible way of large scale mining and artisanal and small scale mining actually interact? Do you have any comments on that?
I think there are 2 factors to consider. So one is the risks and the impacts, and then the other one is actually the social license to operate aspects. So of course, different mining operators will be located in different areas, having different type of geographical location, which means also different barriers from being intrude or having access from external people. So having a solid risks and impact assessment is the key. So you really understand what your exposure is and what measure you can put in place to avoid to produce any negative effects on the people and your operation. But this is just the starting point. I think the fact that you don't have risks and impacts immediate to your operation, that doesn't mean you should not behave as a responsible operator and be part of the discussion. So which is why I added the element of social license to operate. I think that artisanal mining is there to stay. And they have rightly so the right to be there because it's a legal activity. And I think that government artisanal mining needs to be supported in this discussion. So artisanal miners, large-scale miners need to be part of that discussion. And to me, you cannot live in a context of separation. So separation and a reactive approach is not possible anymore. It's not constructive and it's not feasible anymore. So any type of form of active engagement and to the extent of coexisting together is for me what, in this context of DRC and Kolwezi, is what it should look like as a good practice.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Francesca. The questions continue to come in on the Q&A. You've inspired lots of chat and interest there. So I'm going to let you go and address those in the written format. But ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the wonderful Francesca. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Brilliant. So we're going to move from the DRC and cobalt and very much looking at the social aspects, which is an incredibly complicated problem, I guess, to try and get our heads around, especially because it's changing so quickly, exactly as Francesca was outlining there. And now we're going to go into the world of biodiversity and how do we monitor changes in biodiversity. So Andy, I don't know if you want to start sharing your slides. It gives me great pleasure to welcome to the stage from the Natural History Museum in London, Andy Purvis, who's going to be speaking on behalf of himself, Adriana and Richard Harrington. So Andy, take it away.
Thanks very much indeed, Sarah. Just checking, can you hear me all right there? Yeah,
we can. Great. Indeed. Thank you.
So this is work that I've been doing together with Adriana De Palma and Richard Harrington at the Natural History Museum, and it's also an extension of the PREDICTS project. PREDICTS stands for Projecting Responses of Ecological Diversity in Changing Terrestrial Systems. I just want to quickly set the scene. A few years ago, I was involved for 3 years in the IPBES global assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services. And among the headline kind of conclusions of that report was we now have 1 million species that are threatened with extinction. Land use is the biggest threat. Climate change is on top of that. And as a result, there's a growing recognition that we have to bend the curve of biodiversity loss. This is a schematic showing our current trajectory, and there's no single thing we can do to get to a nature positive world where people can live in harmony with nature and get their needs met by natural systems, but there are a set of wedges, different things that we can do. And society has to grasp this nettle, and it has to do it soon. How can mining help to bend the curve? Because on the face of it, as this aerial photo shows, it isn't a nature positive activity. It's clear that the natural biodiversity has been seriously impacted here. What I want to outline over the next few minutes is a framework within which it's possible for mining activities to actually be nature positive, both in terms of biodiversity in local ecosystems worldwide, but also in terms of global rates of species extinction. And at its heart, we have biodiversity data from different systems that enable us to model how biodiversity responds to a range of human impacts. Put that together with plans of proposed mining activities, and it's possible to make projections. and test them against this nature positive criterion. So just anything better than no net loss. Does the plan meet that target? If not, then we need to adjust it by adding some mitigation steps or reducing the immediate impact. And we go round this cycle until we meet the criterion. And then the mining and the associated mitigation can begin. It's monitored to check that we're proceeding on track. The monitoring data go back into the models, refine the projections, and we have adaptive management to ensure that we're still on track for a nature positive mining operation. And if we're falling below, then we have to adjust the plans until we're back on track. I want to introduce a couple of metrics that we've been developing within the museum. We've been using these indicators, for instance, in some modeling for the Dasgupta review into the economics of biodiversity. Two indicators are Biodiversity Intactness Index and 50-year species persistence, or SP50. So first of all, the Biodiversity Intactness Index, the BII. This is basically estimating the average fraction of biodiversity that's still left from what was there naturally. It's still left after human impacts. So here we have a protected area in New Zealand. It's Mount Taranaki, and it has the decency to have almost exact circular borders. And within it, we have native forest, and outside we have farmland. So to estimate BII, you can survey species and compare their population sizes inside and outside. And you do this for a range of species, but you don't do it for species that aren't native, aren't naturally present in the first place. And at the museum, we've compiled a database, the PREDICTS database, that underpins our statistical modeling to estimate BII. And this global database has now got data from over 37,000 sites in 100 countries, over 4 million observations, 54,000 species. That's 2.5% as many as have been formally described. And for each of these sites, as well as the biodiversity, we know about the land use, and if it's restored habitat, we've got an estimate of its age as well. And we also know some of the other human pressures. And that allows us to project the current global state of the Biodiversity Intactness Index, and we can even zoom in. So the lower it is, the less well we're doing, and we can zoom in, for instance, onto the UK, which is where I'm speaking from, and it's as a press release from RSPB attests today, it's one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. It's in the bottom 10%. But it can be modeled at very small scales, and we understand how restoration actions affect what's going on locally, and we can get the BII estimate for an area by averaging the BII from all the sites in that area. So we can mitigate impacts on BII by restoring sites quickly so that the BII starts to recover, but also as a mitigation step, restoring nearby agricultural land, which is not currently supporting a high level of biodiversity, but has the potential to do so. And that can start right away, ideally even before mining. So restoring sites certainly helps reduce the total cumulative impact. Here's an example from a mine in Wisconsin where the topsoil was retained and put back in on top of the sort of nullified waste, and then long-term monitoring set up. And that's a key part of this framework to check that we are indeed on track. So the sort of small scale impact can be managed, and net positive can be assured by restoring habitat within the same region. But the global impact of mining also depends on where it is, because biodiversity is distributed very unevenly around the world. So here is a map of species richness on land and sea from the IPBES global assessment. And we can see that we have these hotspots where it's orders of magnitude more species than there would be in an area in the UK, for instance. And so if your deposit that you're wanting to mine is somewhere up here or here, then it's going to have an impact. It could threaten species with global extinction. Now, that's irreversible, but how then can mining save species? It can, because although habitat loss drives the loss of species, extinction takes time. The oldest known large-scale pattern in ecology is called the species-area relationship, where if you plot on logarithmic axes how many species are in the area against the size of the area, you get a straight line, and the slope is usually around a quarter. And we can use this to predict what will happen to species numbers as we lose area. So if you lose part of your biodiversity hotspot and the area falls, then the species number will fall too, but it doesn't fall right away. Instead, we have an ecological game of musical chairs. We've taken some chairs away. Some players will have to leave the game, but they don't leave until the music stops. And the species where the music has not yet stopped are called the extinction debt. And these are species that mining companies could save, because there are probably hundreds of thousands of species worldwide waiting for the music to stop. So this is a map of where they are concentrated, and they're areas that were high in species with narrow distributions in the first place and have had high levels of recent habitat loss. So restoring natural habitat in these badly hit areas could save more species than would be wiped out by the mining operation. And we can model this. We can model the 50-year effect on species persistence and increase mitigation until the plan is nature positive. And so for the large region that we're looking at, we can look at how species extinctions are going to accumulate over the coming decades under business as usual. We can see that unmitigated mining, because it's destroying some unique habitat, is adding to that. But by putting mitigation in place, restoring some of these areas with high extinction debt, and ideally starting before the mining activity starts, then although there's a blip where the cumulative number of extinctions is briefly higher, by the 50-year mark, it's a nature positive mining impact. So how to mitigate the impacts on SP50? You need to minimize the footprint within hotspots of rare species. So some of the associated infrastructure of the mine might need to be moved a bit further away. So for instance, preventing urbanization near the mine if the mine is somewhere very sensitive. Restoring sites again is quickly putting is again good, putting some chairs back before the music stops, but also restoring area elsewhere with high extinction debt, starting right away. And so it's possible, provided that what's being mined in the first place is carbon neutral or carbon positive, it's possible to have nature positive mining. And at the museum, we've developed the models and metrics that can be used to plan mining to make sure it's nature positive. And we've also got the experience and technology for the monitoring to make sure that the plans are working and continually refine and improve the models as well. Thanks very much indeed for the opportunity to speak, and thank you for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Andy. That was absolutely brilliant. So ladies and gentlemen, please give a round of applause from behind your microphones to the wonderful Andy Purvis. Now, Andy, the questions are coming in thick and fast. So I know that you've got one or two of your co-authors sitting in the attendees. If you want them to come into the panel, then just give me a wave and we can move them across. So I think that was a yes, Rose. So let's move across. I know that Richard's definitely there at the moment. While that's happening, Andy, a couple of questions questions that have come in here. So this one from Jamie Strauss. He asks, have some of the new mining regulations and practices in developed countries such as Canada moved the biodiversity formula closer or even into that nature positive spot? What do you think?
I would defer to Richard on that one. So my background is very much on the biodiversity modelling side, rather than within the kind of mining legislation. Richard, I see you've joined us now.
Yeah, I have. Unfortunately, I lost the sound just as you asked the question, Sarah. So could you just repeat that? And then
that's brilliant.
So I'm not bluffing. So it's just didn't hear
sorry,
it.
that was the Zoom buffer that you were receiving, yeah. I think, at that point in time. So question from Jamie Strice, and he asks, have some of the new mining regulations and practices in countries such as Canada, is that helping to move biodiversity into that more positive spot, or do you think we've still got a way to go?
Yeah, well, I think the thing that we don't have are the sort of the metrics, which is what Andy's proposing here is. So that, you know, it's still at the point. I think they're really good what's been implemented, but they don't maybe have the specific metrics to be able to, for people to sort of balance one intervention versus another one. And I think that's, if you're trying to develop an industry where people think that they're making a difference, you need to have to be able to compare different mitigation strategies. And I think none of that sort of metrics is written into the new those new initiatives. Although they are very positive, I think it's trying to get some metrics in so that organisations know whether this is better than this particular choice. So I think it's on the right way, it's on the right move, but I think we really need to push it where we've got metrics where people actually know where they are. Are they doing something net positive or detrimental?
Cool, thanks for that, Richard. So we need the metrics coming in. Yes, Andy.
Yeah, just to add to Richard's point, one of the advantages, both of these metrics are using aspects of biodiversity that are already used in reporting by, for instance, Global Biodiversity Outlook, IPBES. So, and they're fully general. They're not specific to the particular species living in a place. So they can be compared across broad areas and aggregated up to a global picture. So you can have consistent reporting from a local scale up to global, which wouldn't be possible with a lot of monitoring-based indicators.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you, Andy. One of the other questions coming in. So when you showed that, so when you were talking about your musical chairs, and waiting for that music to stop or hoping it wouldn't stop, and the map that you showed us there, my apologies, I can't remember who it was cited to, but Madagascar just stuck out amazingly. So, I mean, what is happening there? Surely Madagascar should be receiving more attention than perhaps it is, or maybe it is receiving attention and we're just not really hearing about it at the moment because of that thing called COVID, etc.
So Madagascar is among the richest places in terms of species found nowhere else, endemic species. And so in the UK, our biodiversity is quite lucky in that it's overwhelmingly also found elsewhere. And so if it disappears locally, then, you know, that is a shame, but it isn't a species extinction. Madagascar has lots of species with tiny ranges and they're found nowhere else. And it's had very rapid loss of some of the key habitats as well. And as a result, yeah, there's a lot of species that are doomed unless there's large-scale habitat restoration. So, and there isn't enough funding going into those restoration activities at the moment.
Which is a real point of concern, I guess. Just moving into another little question here, just to try and squeeze it in. So this is from Dan Smith, so one of the other panelists, and he asks, how do mines and authorities handle the fact that much of the land use impact footprint might not be from the actual mining companies themselves, but from urbanization and other things that either come with that development or just also the commercial agriculture in the area, taking advantage of the road infrastructure etc. So all of that complexity, I guess, of changing humans as well. And so he asked, who will be using your models? Is this designed for everybody to use, or is it something that's specifically for the likes of mining?
So the modeling framework is general for any kind of land use class, any kind of business sector. The precise details of the modeling, that needs to be tuned to the impacts of particular sectors. But yeah, it's basically a framework and a toolkit that can be used by any actor that's wanting to make sure it's making a nature positive contribution. Brilliant.
So hopefully, Dan, that answers your question.
I think the other thing to say is that this is where the whole life cycle of the mine and its impacts needs to be modelled in. You know, as you say, it's about the community. Andy said, you know, don't build the town nearby. You've got to find some way of regulating all those other things that are related to mining, because they're part of the cost, aren't they? They're also they're the benefit, and they're also part of the cost. And so it's very complicated, but that's probably where the regulators need to sort of get on top of that, to sort of link in those adjacent things like roads going in and agriculture and all of those kind of things.
So I guess this is almost, I mean, we've been talking quite a lot about shared value in the social space. In a way, this is helping to shine a light on shared value in the biodiversity space, given the changes that mining brings to an area. And of course, hopefully the long-term view that we are stewards of that land for a very short period of time. We're not there forever, and we're hopefully not there destroying it. But with that, Andy, Richard, and everybody else, thank you so much. That was absolutely brilliant. So round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for Andy Purvis. Thank you very much. Great. Now, Andy, there are a bucket load of questions, by the way, coming in. So if you've got some time, take a look at the Q&A and also the chat as well. And so Andy was there giving us these metrics. And I mean, we've seen the huge value that's there within that. We're now going to go across to Veer Ross-Gillespie, who's going to be speaking to us now. Veer, just say hello, just to check your sounds.
Hopefully you can hear me normally.
Oh, thank you, because earlier on today, Veer, he doesn't look like a chipmunk, but he certainly sounded like a chipmunk. So I'm really glad that we've got your normal voice. And Veer, if you want to start sharing your slides, Veer is going to actually kind of build on this topic of biodiversity that Andy's given us great insight to, and introduce to us, and in fact build on, because Kat Bruce gave us a talk last year from Nature Metrics on everything that Nature Metrics have been up to, which is the DNA-based methods for biodiversity monitoring. And of course, this can be used for mine sites, but of course, anywhere else in the world. And this year, we invited Kat and her team back again to give us a bit of an update, because I hope you will all agree this tool is awesome. Veer, over to yourself.
Thanks very much, Sarah. And I just want to quickly get some notes up here for myself as well. Great. Hopefully you can all still see the main screen. It's really my pleasure to talk to you all today about these innovative DNA-based methods for biodiversity monitoring. So in the talk today, I'll cover some of the context around biodiversity monitoring in the mining sector specifically, introduce DNA-based methods, how they can be used, who we are, and what work we're doing with Anglo American to apply this technology globally for more informed decision-making. So just in terms of some context, and we've had some brilliant talks just to lead into this. The one from Andy just now really set the scene. But here we are with the World Economic Forum Risk Report of 2021. And once again, biodiversity loss is ranked as a top global risk in terms of likelihood and impact, so 5th and 4th place respectively. And while being down one spot from 2019 owing to COVID and infectious diseases, this is an increasing trend from previous years and will likely increase in the years to come. And interestingly, up the top right, there's global shapers' perceptions, and these are the young generation, the entrepreneurs, and their perceptions are that the environmental risks specifically have a far greater likelihood and impact compared to the views of the multi-stakeholders who actually were responsible for putting this report together. Fortunately, the increasing global appreciation of the importance of biodiversity loss and the environment, including the ecosystem services, has led to a greater number of mining companies and industries incorporating ESG plus I frameworks and making stronger commitments to biodiversity targets like no net loss, net positive impact, nature positive, and ensuring that these are applied to the mitigation hierarchy, which you can see down here. And this is partly owing to greater pressure being placed on them through governments and regulators and financiers, and in line with the Equator Principles and the IFC performance standards, but also because of competitive behavior, public perception, and far greater scrutinization of supply chains by discerning customers, as we've heard. And I really believe the financiers and insurers have a really positive role to play in this space, as we heard on Monday from James Fryer, by offering finance and insurance options to projects that include only strong and clear biodiversity and ESG plus I commitments. So over the past couple of years, reviews have shown that there's been a sharp uptake in mining companies' commitments to biodiversity, specifically from 2003 to 2016 and possibly beyond. We just don't have the latest data. But in 2014, a review was done by the IEC and Extractives panel. And at that point in time, all ICMM members had some form of commitment to biodiversity. And this was a 50% increase compared to 2003. So there you can see that rise over time. But alarmingly, over time, a number of companies have started to change their commitments. And as a result, those commitments have become unclear, or companies have started retracting their commitments altogether. And of course, this is reflected quite badly on many companies and was viewed as corporates backing away from public accountability for biodiversity impacts and dependencies. And this is concerning. But why was this the case? And I really liked Andy's talk because I think he set the scene here to say the model and what needs to happen. So some of the problems that lead to the retractions of biodiversity commitments or hesitancy to commit to them in the first place include limited corporate traction, difficulties with actually measuring the outcomes of those measures that are put in place, slow uptake from the finance industry to apply pressure, lack of objective repeatable data, and this is possibly one of the biggest issues, and we're going to touch on that in this talk. The difficulty to relate back to reference or baseline conditions and actually compare the new data that's being collected to the reference conditions. And then this need for the science-based criteria and metrics that both Andy mentioned. But also, as we know, biodiversity surveys historically and using conventional techniques are very costly and very time-consuming with long-term commitments needed. And unfortunately, during the time that these new commitments came out for NPI and NNL, so no net loss and net positive impact, there weren't a lot of pilot sites actually being studied and being looked at to help formulate those metrics and refine them. So with the problems and the challenges of biodiversity monitoring in mind, we're in a very fortunate position now with 21st century technology and recent scientific discoveries. And these have presented some fantastic opportunities to assist in this space. And DNA-based monitoring affords scalable, high-capacity biodiversity monitoring, really providing data now at unprecedented rates and also with relative ease. And this affords me the opportunity to introduce nature metrics. We were founded to bridge the gap between molecular scientists and environmental managers, and putting the tools in the hands of those who need them and making those tools accessible. What tended to happen is the molecular scientists were coming up with fantastic new discoveries and tools, but then publishing them in obscure journals, and this never made it into the hands of the environmental managers. Currently, we're based in the UK, but we have a global outlook, and we're working with clients from different sectors around the globe on projects ranging from research to compliance and statutory monitoring. And in effect, we do a full end-to-end service from provision of sampling kits through to the laboratory analysis, and then the computational processing and reporting. But I want to dive in quickly to what these DNA-based monitoring methods are. So meta-barcoding is an approach that can be applied to many different types of samples. This could be an insect sample from a malaise trap or a pitfall trap. It could be a soil or sediment sample, or it could be a water sample either from the ocean or from water bodies nearby. Essentially anything that contains the DNA of multiple different species. We extract the total DNA from the sample and we sequence it on a high throughput sequencer to generate a profile of the taxonomic diversity contained in the sample. And in fact, we can process many different mixed species samples in parallel, generating vast data sets within a matter of weeks. Now, the beauty of eDNA and metabarcoding is the ease with which a sample can be collected. The kits that we provide contain everything you need and have been designed for ease of use. So even in remote sampling locations and specifically for the tropics. So using the example of a biodiversity survey of water, perhaps around a mine site, you can simply collect a water sample and process it in 15 minutes on site using our filters. And you don't need any cold storage or any means to reduce clogging, because that's already built in. So you don't need pumps, you don't need batteries, you don't need equipment. This is all nice and light, and you could put it in a backpack. What happens is the DNA then gets stuck on the filter, and you send that filter to the Naturmetrics lab, and then we process it. And in the lab, our expert team go through a series of steps. We extract the DNA, and then we can do this for a range of taxonomic groups, and this is where it really gets exciting. So we can even do multiple groups from a single sample, and normally there's some DNA left over, so we could go back and do this analysis and amplify the DNA for up to 4 different groups. Then what happens is we sequence that data, and we have about 100 samples being run normally at a time on the sequencer, and that spits out about 300,000 sequences per sample and a data file that has about 30 million sequences. And that's a heap of data. That's an immense amount of data that we've never been able to generate before. And what do you do with all this data? So the first step is we sequence that data, and then we start to match those sequences to the species that they belong to. And this is a sophisticated step, and our bioinformaticians have specially designed workflows to tackle this. It relies on having a reference database of DNA sequences for the region that you're interested in. So our team can then check the taxonomic gaps for your project and sites, and we can even do this before you begin. And then we can also advise on how to address them through barcoding campaigns, where you can start to generate the fingerprints for those reference libraries. But at the end of the day, you'll be presented with a scientific report detailing the species found at your project site. And now you've got something that looks recognizable as a species by site table. And everyone wants to know whether the numbers of sequences here have anything to do with the actual species abundance. And the answer is that for animals living in water like fish, it does indeed give a good indication of the relative abundance of different species at a site. So how can these immense data sets be used? Whether freshwater, terrestrial, or marine, onshore, offshore data obtained from DNA-based methods, whether it's eDNA or soil metabarcoding, can be used to inform all stages of the mitigation hierarchy and asset lifecycle, from exploration all the way through to closure, avoidance, through to offsetting. And using small organisms obtained from sediments or invertebrates, site restoration can be tracked in terms of efficiency over time, and even whole biomes can be assessed, and critical communities can be monitored in relation to impacts over the long term. So this takes a look at the communities rather than necessarily individual species. We can detect those individual species, but we're starting to move towards looking at whole communities and how whole communities are shifting. Ultimately, this information will help us to learn what good looks like, and we can start to apply machine learning and predictive modeling on these data sets with the big data that's provided to help us determine efficiently what condition the ecosystem is based on the biodiversity data. And this brings us to the work we're now doing with Anglo American. A new partnership will see DNA-based methods being applied at 12 pilot projects in 10 different countries, with those sites representing 10 different terrestrial ecoregions. And I'll briefly go through just a subset of these pilot projects to illustrate the ways in which the DNA-based tools are being applied for projects at different stages of their life cycle, and also with different priorities in terms of the mitigation hierarchy. And hopefully this will give you a flavor for how these tools could be applied perhaps at some of the mine sites you might be managing or involved with. So the first is really at the exploration stage. And we've heard that there needs to be more of an impetus placed on collecting biodiversity data early on. And the value here is that a geologist or a technician somebody who is not biodiversity minded or ecologically minded has the ability to take with them some kits and get data at the earliest stages of a project. This could be 15 minutes spent sampling a number of sites around the mine, and then using those aquatic eDNA sampling kits to obtain information on species that might be present. And these could be high-risk species, so they could be highly threatened or endangered species, but we'll also get the whole community information. And this is really useful for baselining and early risk mitigation. And so here really in the avoidance stage of that mitigation hierarchy. Flinging across now to a more seasonal environment, and also one where it's in the middle of a design and planning phase. You now have the ability to collect immense amount of data during the baselining stages before there's any construction or development, and really characterize the diversity that might be present at a site. So here, this is an opportunity from Finland, where we are involved in a high diversity bog and mire environment, which is close to a Natura 2000 reserve. And here the eDNA can be used to collect information on whole invertebrate communities, vertebrates, fish, native mussels, and even looking at some of the sediments to understand the bacteria, fungi, and metazoa, some of the small groups that up till now have largely been ignored, but really underpin ecosystems. Coming across to the UK, we've got a project that's now within the construction or development phase, looking at ways of avoidance and minimizing impacts. And this is an underground mine in a national park, and really with a wide range of DNA monitoring happening here on different communities, from rivers, ponds, wetlands, and also sediments. And looking at vertebrates, invertebrates, fish, and also diatoms, which are excellent integrators of water quality. But a real value add here is being able to engage with the national park and also citizen scientists and really get them involved in collecting accurate, objective data through citizen science. Coming across to a desert and xeric shrubland here in Southern Africa. This is a highly arid area, water scarce, and you might say, well, how do you use eDNA now from water bodies? And the fascinating thing here is there are ephemeral pan systems that are highly seasonal, but you can also get aquatic eDNA from artificial watering points within the landscape. And this can allow you to see what animals might be present in and around the mining area and in land management zones. But also because it's an area of high insect diversity, there is insect sampling happening on site, and we can now ease the way in which those insect samples are processed, removing the need to some degree from the microscope and augmenting data sets by looking at that whole sample and meta-barcoding it. And then of course, with offset and restoration targets, we can start to look at sites that might be earmarked for offsetting or for restoration, and we can start to track those sites through time. And then this is the penultimate one, is a marine site here of Namibia. And just to illustrate the fact that the same methods can be applied in the deep sea environment. So looking at benthic marine sediments and looking specifically at impact and recovery over time, but using groups like bacteria and metazoa. And in this particular instance, there's a strong focus on building up the barcoding database and the reference library. There's some fantastic invertebrates that have already been collected, and now we can augment that data set and sequence it and get the individual sequences for those species so that we can better inform eDNA and DNA meta-barcoding going forward. The last is to show that this can also happen at a landscape scale within catchments and whole catchments within an entire municipality. So this is metallurgical coal in Australia. And the idea here is to look at linking in with the basin association and partnerships that are already monitoring sites and receiving water bodies all over Queensland, and tie into those and be able to augment their data sets with far more data, possibly for some of the groups that they are already using, but maybe some that they haven't engaged with. So vertebrates, invertebrates, and fish. And this now just allows me to end off with talking about some of these opportunities. I think the DNA-based monitoring methods really allow for accurate, repeatable, efficient sampling. It allows anybody to go and take a sample, and therefore democratizing the way in which biodiversity data is obtained. It allows for reduced costs and timeframes, specifically reduced health and safety risks, and it allows for early risk identification for projects. But the big data that's generated can really help augment conventional surveys but also lead to machine learning and predictive modeling opportunities. So I think this allows for really realistic biodiversity monitoring and also learning within consortia. So there are consortiums, and we're engaging with the Biodiversity Consultancy and FFI and others to really understand what net positive impact metrics, how they need to be refined, what data can feed into them. And I think the predicts model that we've just heard about could be a fantastic one to apply in this space. And we can feed the data that's obtained from eDNA into those models. And we can also link it to some of the satellite technology that we heard earlier. So really generating some fantastic data products for sustainable mining going forward. There are opportunities here for skills transfer and upskilling to staff. So really feeding into the S and the G and also the I parts of this, because we can even involve native communities in the sampling and putting the kits in their hands. So yeah, great opportunities for community monitoring, co-engaged learning and outreach. And ultimately, we can also leave a lasting legacy by building up these reference libraries that are so desperately needed for certain areas, and that way contribute to science and research going forward. So thanks very much for listening. Really appreciate that, and I'm looking forward to any questions and discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Veer. A massive round of applause from all of us on the other side of our muted microphones. Every time I listen to you guys and your updates, I just want to give you a massive hug, because what you guys are doing is truly phenomenal. Also, a massive thanks for giving us a tour through Anglo-American. Having spent quite a lot of my early career in that company, it was really lovely to see some of those projects and operations and how they're getting on. We've got time for one very quick question, and actually that comes back to the Anglo side of things. So you mentioned the likes of Sakatti in Finland, and then the slightly more developed project here in the UK. Are you seeing any evidence so far where the company is making use of the data that you're collecting and then altering the mine design or the plans based on what you're finding, or is it still too early to tell?
Yeah, it's a great question. It is still too early, unfortunately. I mean, these projects, this is like hot off the press, being able to actually talk about the fact that we're now partnering and coming in. So this year we'll see a number of the monitoring ideas kicking off at these sites. So possibly in a year's time, I'll be able to report back in a better way about the data that's being obtained. I think, you know, it also depends on the stage in which the projects are in the EIA process. And Sakatti is really early on in the EIA process. Whereas Woodsmith is a little bit more developed and far advanced. So certainly for mitigation and management, ongoing management, yes, I think the data will certainly feed into that. And our idea is to work with the mines to understand the management interventions that they can apply and do that in a smart manner.
Great. And one sneaky question, if I can. This comes in from Amanda. This is a nasty one, by the way. She says, number one, how expensive is the product? But then number two, how do you deal with the risk to the mining company that they/you find something that then slows down the project?
Great questions. So the first, in answering the first one, it is, you know, if you compare the cost of doing a biodiversity survey for a number of different taxonomic groups, the relative costs actually, you know, it's cheaper to go the eDNA route because you can cover more organisms for less time in the field and less need for expertise in the field. So to give you a sense, I mean, it's around £275 per sample, and that would include a single group like vertebrates. So you can get an immense amount of data from a single sample collected in 15 minutes, where you would need normally a group of 4 specialists to collect that data. So that should give you a sense, but on that same sample, you can then add additional taxonomic groups for around £100 per additional group. So now you can get 4 or 5 different whole taxonomic groups from a single sample. So that gives you a sense of the costs. The key thing here is actually looking at the study design, the sampling design, and making sure that that is intelligent. And I'm sure Andy will agree with that, and some of the others. You want to plan that early on and make sure that you've got a good sampling design in place. In terms of the second part of the question, sorry, can you just remind me exactly what that was?
Yeah, how do you deal with the threat to mining companies that you might find something that then either stops or slows the project down?
Yes, good question. You know, I'm very relieved to see that mining companies generally are being far more transparent about biodiversity data. I think before, that transparency may not have been there because of risks and financing and everything else. But I think now there's far greater pressure on mines being transparent with data. I think that there's a sensitivity towards organisms that might be poachable or have high value on black markets. That is where you then need to be very careful in the data that's shared. But ultimately, if it's a species of high conservation concern, you want to know about that early on. So the take-home message, I think, from us is that apply these tools in the earliest stage of a project before it hits the late stages of an EIA. Apply it in the exploration phase of the project.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Veer. I could carry on asking you questions for hours, but we do have our wonderful next speaker who's all teed up and ready to go. So ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the wonderful Veer and Nature Metrics. Thank you very much, mate. Great. So next to our stage, we have the fantastic Louis Machal, who comes to us from the OECD. Now, Louis, I don't know if we have slides for you or if you're just speaking to camera. We do have some slides. So now is the right opportunity for us to start sharing them.
I think I will do that, yeah.
Fantastic. So while that's happening, and here we have it just being shared now. Louis, I'm going to allow you to introduce yourself and get cracking with your talk. Thank you very much, Louis.
Sure. Thank you very much for the invitation. So my name is Louis Marachal. I work with the OECD. I'm one of the sector lead on the project looking at the implementation of our standard on responsible supply chain of minerals. We just had our annual forum taking place at the end of April, and it was all virtual, and we had quite a large participation with several hundred people connecting, which was really fantastic. So I'm really glad to be back again this year. I was invited last year, and happy to come back to focus a bit more on the various tools that our team has been developing over the years, and more specifically over the past 12 months, since we were all stuck because of COVID. We had a lot of time to actually go deep into some of the topics that we wanted to tackle for a number of months, and I'll be happy to share a bit more on these. I'll just take a couple of minutes to remind everyone of what the OECD guidance is and what is its purpose and objective. So it's basically, well, we could say a tool. It's a guidance for companies to help them understand how they can map their supply chain and conduct risk assessments throughout their supply chain to identify any potential connection with conflict financing, serious economic crimes, or abuses of human rights. Basically, this guidance requires those companies to undertake due diligence, and when they do identify a risk, to implement mitigation strategies. So the technical objective of this guidance is the one that I just described, but the overall objective is really to promote responsible investments in minerals resources production and trade in conflict affected and high risk areas. So this is really pretty much a tool whose objective is to enable companies to remain engaged in conflict zones or post-conflict zones, because we all know that in many of those areas, the extractive sector is pretty much the only one that's conducive to economic development if it's done the right way. So this really is a tool to help companies invest responsibly in the extractive sector in, again, what we call conflict affected and high-risk areas. And that's what these are is a bit more complex. I can get into that later on, but that's pretty much the objective of our work. Oops, I don't know what just happened here. Some milestone. We started the negotiation of this guidance in 2009. It was adopted in 2011. And since then, it's been basically supported and promoted by many countries and industry associations, which have increasingly turned it into mandatory requirements. So initially, our standard is voluntary, but it's now part of the US law, the famous Dodd-Frank Act. Perhaps you know that Section 1502 on supply chain transparency. It's now EU regulation that's come into force on January 1st. So it's now a mandatory requirements for importers of gold, tin, tantalum, and tungsten into the EU to implement our guidance. The LME, London Metal Exchange, has turned this standard into a mandatory requirements for smelters and refiners. That will come into force, I think, in 2023. The LBMA for the gold sector has done the same, etc., etc. We're also talking with China and India and several other countries. The DRC has also integrated the provisions of the guidance into its own mining regulation. So it's really an increasing trend from all sides to turn those voluntary standards into mandatory requirements. Sorry again, just a snapshot of the global efforts of implementation. So basically, I'm not going to repeat too much of what I just said. It just provides you with a more user-friendly representation of that. But since we're working all along the supply chain from point of extraction to point of consumption, we have projects all around the world in producing areas and countries, in consuming countries, in trading hubs, and of course, in processing countries. So we've been making, for instance, lately some interesting progress in India on gold, in China on cobalt. I could go on for hours about this, but this is really truly a global implementation program with a significant uptake in all parts of the world. I won't spend too much time on this, but this is basically what I just said. Again, sorry for that, I don't know what's happening. I was just talking about the fact that our voluntary standard is increasingly turned into mandatory requirements. This is another demonstration of that. So that's not only focusing on the OECD guidance for responsible supply chain of minerals, but it covers all the standards that our Center for Responsible Business Conduct has been developing in the past 10 years. And what you can see is that increasingly our member states are using those voluntary guidance and standards to feed into their own regulatory process. And this is really, again, only increasing. Switzerland has recently announced that it would as well turn our guidance into a mandatory requirement. So it will be a legal expectation under Swiss law, I think next year, to implement our guidance for all imports of gold. So that's really something that companies should be mindful of. Some key achievements up to date. So we've been implementing this for about, well, a bit less than 10 years now, but we can really see a significant uptake from countries and market makers and companies. Significant uptake and increasing participation from the private sector. Some of them forced, some of them being leader and understanding that it's probably in their own benefit. An increased understanding of what due diligence in supply chain means. Of course, due diligence is more of a financial term in the origin, but it's been increasingly applied to those issues of risk assessments and risk identification throughout supply chain. And I think companies are now increasingly aware of what that means and why this is being asked of them. And also something that we're very proud of, an increased global awareness of the need to engage with the artisanal mining sector. We do work a lot on ASM, of course, because this is the part of the supply chain that's the most vulnerable to conflict financing, racketeering, serious abuses of human rights. So a lot of our work is about how can we help global companies engage with responsible ASM and include them in their own mineral supply chains. Of course, we still have a lot of remaining challenges. In particular, sorry, this is getting out of hand. Don't know really why. So yeah, more meaningful and sorry about that. I'll try to get out of the presentation. That might make it easier. Yes. Works better. Some remaining challenges. Of course, due diligence is still a sort of a new concept, as I said, when it comes to undertaking due diligence in your supply chain. So what exactly does that mean? How can you do that, et cetera, et cetera. That takes a lot of and promotional efforts. We have been doing that for a number of years, engaging with all sorts of companies, small and medium and large multinational, at all stages of the supply chain. So it is making progress, but it's still very challenging on some aspects. More financial support for the ASM sector in particular. This is extremely challenging for these companies to engage on the formalization and legalization path. So even though we have seen a switch in the mindset of large companies turning from a complete ban of ASM to a more open attitude towards ASM, that there is a lot of progress that still needs to be achieved. I mean, we still have many challenges, I have to say, but we still see a lot of demand for conflict-free minerals, as opposed to demand for minerals that come with the right level of assurance, that risk assessments have been undertaken and mitigation strategies have been implemented. So again, a lot of education still needs to take place. It is very challenging for companies, obviously, because they have to manage a lot of expectations and their own legal constraints and requirements from their own clients on sometimes Africa-free supply chains or conflict-free supply chain. This is all. This takes a lot of time to go into the nuance and explain that our approach, as I said, is about engaging with the weakest part of the supply chain and not just boycotting and de-risking completely those supply chains. So that's keeping us busy at the moment.
Louis, can I ask you a question while
Sure.
you're still on the standards?
Yeah.
You showed us in a couple of slides ago, like different standards applied into different countries that incorporate what the OECD did.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you a question. So recently, the European Commission made these announcements about the EU going to develop their own proposal for due diligence on human rights and environmental impacts for companies based in Europe. How do you think this is going to change this whole standardization process, and what kind of more benefits that can bring into the table?
Well, luckily it's being done in sort of consultation with the OECD. Those discussions have been taking place for a number of years. We're working extremely closely with the European Union, as you can imagine. The draft regulation on conflict minerals was tabled in 2014, and that's about the time that we started cooperating a lot with the EU. So there's a lot of expectation on what the EU can do with this proposal. Hopefully there's already quite a lot of experience that's been accumulated on what is feasible and how you can actually achieve meaningful due diligence throughout supply chain. Now, of course, the current proposal would be taking this to a whole new level and a different, it's much bigger than what we've been talking about this far. Mm-hmm. It's extremely ambitious, but I think like companies are, as I said, now understand that this is a trend that they should not be fighting any longer. We've had a lot of resistance in the past. This is really decreasing. Honestly, I can tell you we've had like massive resistance and setbacks in the early days and even 3 or 4 years ago. But now with the support of many actually market participants, companies, even though they don't necessarily like it, understand they have to live with it. And again, here, for instance, the London Metal Exchange Initiative was a game changer for us. Because this involves all the main metals markets and the biggest supply chains in the world when you're talking about minerals and metals. So to your question, I think this has a big potential to change significantly a lot of things. I always like to manage expectations. Things will not change overnight. This will take years and years and years. But it has to start somewhere, and it's really good that it's starting now. And I do believe that this will change a lot of attitude in the business.
Thank you.
The question. So coming now to some of the tools that we've been developing, and we're still busy developing. So this is pretty much our day-to-day job. So a lot of what we do is technical advice, either to companies or governments, companies or industry association, etc., looking at how they can meaningfully operationalize, as we put it, our instruments. A lot of technical advice to governments and regional organizations. As I just said, we were extremely involved in the development of the EU regulation. The OECD Secretariat has actually a role by law in the EU regulation, which is a first for the OECD. So we tend to have bilateral conversations with different countries. For instance, at the moment, we're having a lot of conversations with India, with Colombia, with the DRC on cobalt. So that's a big chunk of our work. But I'd like to focus now on what we do in terms of research and tools development, because this is also at the heart of what we do. I have inputted here several hyperlinks that will be easier for you to click on and consult the documents that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But basically, one of our first mission, I would say, has been to commission what we call baseline assessments on producing areas. So we started in the DRC in 2015, went into Colombia in 2017, West Africa 2018, back to the DRC in 2019 on cobalt and copper. And forthcoming, there's a report on baseline assessment on gold supply chains in Venezuela. So basically what we do is a high-level risk assessment of those supply chains to flag any potential risk. When we talk about risk, we talk about those that we focus on, so conflict financing, serious abuses of human rights, and serious economic crimes. So those documents are widely available, and we hope that they help shed some light on the risk profile of these areas. Some of them we also commissioned with a specific objective as well. I have to say that the one on cobalt and copper in 2019 in the DRC was also to put back a little bit of the pressure on the large-scale mining companies in the context of the DRC. Sometimes some stakeholders have a tendency to use our work as a sort of a pretext to sort of ban ASM, pretending that all risks only exist in the ASM supply chain. Well, this report was actually intended to correct this misconception. And there's another project that was associated that I'm going to talk about in a minute. We really work on large-scale mining and artisanal and small-scale mining. You have different risks in those two parts of the supply chain, but they can be as important and as serious. And I think that's a message that we've been busy hammering in the past 2 years. I think the conversation is now balanced a bit. But a couple of years ago, it was all about ASM, so we felt that we needed to correct a bit of that. We're currently doing some, by the way, just wanted to come back on a document that we just recently released, which is a frequently asked question on corruption in mineral supply chains. You can click on the links, you'll get access to it. It's basically a document that helps companies understand how they can conduct risk assessment of corruption deep down in their supply chain. So not just on their tier 1 supplier or tier 2 supplier, but the idea is to allow, for instance, a large automotive company to understand if it may be connected with corruption in any producing country. And you'll make the connection, I think, yourself with the previous report that I just mentioned. So this is a very good representation of the type of tool that we're trying to develop. Very user-friendly. It's a series of 12 questions, I think. We have done the same for responsible sourcing of ASM products. Questions that we've been asked consistently in the past. So we've taken all of these, put them together, brainstormed a bit, and tried to provide the private sector with some sort of easy answer on how they can conduct due diligence on corruption in mineral supply chains. Another big project that we've been able to advance in 2020, thanks to the pandemic, I would say, is research on the uptake, impact, and impact of our work. So we have released, and the end of April, a monitoring and evaluation framework of our own initiative. We've been also able to sort of identify the increase in the uptake of our work by companies, looking at a panel of 500 companies all around the world. This is all available on our website. And again, it's available on the links that I just shared. The work on impact will be published, I think, in June or July. So the first serious look at our own, at the impact of our own work, in particular on you know, the conflict situation in the various countries that we're working in. So that's another very important project, and something that's really expected by our donors, as well as by the private sector at large, because you know, a fair question is, you're asking all of us to make those efforts, but how can you demonstrate that this is having any sort of impact? So that's exactly what we've been trying to do with this work. Another very interesting project that we were able to launch in April is what we call the Trends in Stakeholder Reporting. It's been a very complex and ambitious project. We've been reviewing around 40 different supply chains over 2 years, looking at publicly available sources with allegations of risks in those supply chains. So again, the report is available on our website. I just took those two nice graph that actually demonstrates and further emphasize the fact that risks are actually existing in all mineral supply chain. That shouldn't be a surprise at all, but it was to many of our stakeholders. You also have on the right an interesting graph that shows the risks that were mostly associated to those supply chains as per our research. So as I said, we covered 40 different supply chains, looking at 7 different languages. So we're not at all endorsing the allegations. This is just a tool to help companies start their due diligence. Just imagine that you're a company that's using 10 different minerals and metals, and you're trying to understand which one is potentially you know, the riskiest for your company. This report will help you do that, and it will help you understand where you need to be looking for additional information. This report will also help you contextualize your due diligence efforts. So say if you're reading an article on any given risk in any given geography, this report will help you understand whether this is likely or whether this is completely impossible, etc., etc. So that's another tool that we've been developing to help companies implement our guidance. And I think I'll stop there. Just like to invite you to click on the second link here, the due diligence guidance. Let me see if I can do that now. No, I can't. This is basically a tool that we've also developed, a virtual version of the OECD guidance. And this is something that will help you go through the various steps of the OECD guidance in a much more user-friendly way than just going through the 140 pages of our documents. So I'll stop there. Thanks again for your attention, and I'll be really happy to take any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Louis. That was absolutely fantastic. So a round of applause from all of us in your audience. Unfortunately, we are running a little bit behind on time now. And seeing as Francesca managed to ask you a brilliant question in the middle of your talk, if you'd be able to copy and paste that link into the chat, that would be great, because then I think people will take a look at it whilst they're watching. And instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to welcome Jamie Strauss to the stage. So Jamie, if you want to turn the video on, the mute button off, share the slides, etc. We're going to move straight into our next talk, which is with regards to Digby. Now, we heard from Jamie last year, not necessarily talking about the developments within the ESG space that he's got coming through at the moment, but there's been huge development going on within Digby. Now, Jamie, yeah, excellent. Your video is coming now, which is brilliant. I'm going to let you share your slides, and then I will pass across to yourself to get cracking. So thank you very much, Jamie.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'll just share the slides. I'll just start off there. Blue screen, can you see a blue screen?
We can, yes, there we go. It's just worked now. So Jamie, ladies and gentlemen, Jamie Strauss.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm okay. So let me just, first of all, thank Sarah and her team for this great conference. Coming last is always a benefit because you get a chance to read up on or listen to everybody else's speeches. And I think the big change and the encouragement from last year is I think there's been an enormous amount of positive momentum across all the different angles which have been talked about today, well, not just today, over the week. And I think that really adds to the hope and expectation, at least internally within the industry, that we can move to a more positive perception and action on the ground. Let me just tell you a story. Actually, I just want to, I had some notes, so I'm just actually going to come off a little bit of this, and sorry to be a little bit
so I guess while Jamie's sorting his slides out, maybe a bit of background and maybe a story. I don't know if this is the same story or if it's a different story, Jamie. We met probably 19 months ago, something like that, at the Minds and Money conference in London. We were sitting around a round table talking about, okay, there are all of these frameworks and metrics and things like that that are expected of mining companies, but then also perhaps expected of investors who are saying that they're looking at the more responsible form of investment. But is any of it actually working, or is it all just greenwash? And that's where a really fruitful conversation got going. And I think some of that has now flowed into the Digby ESG solution, which is really exciting. So Jamie, back to yourself.
Good, thanks very much. It was a different story, but that's a good one to start off with. And I'm normally on 2 screens, but Builder's in the office, so I couldn't today. So let me just tell you a quick story. 18 months ago, I was on a webinar just before I met Sarah with a load of very senior fund managers in the community. And I think a lot of your viewers will be aware that the fund management industry is now being obligated to create or to follow ESG. And therefore, what they're saying is really important because it flows down into almost every single talk you have had this week. And confusion reigned. Mining company management had no idea what and how to disclose ESG, and fund managers equally had no ability to track ESG on a measurable basis, on a standardized basis. And as a result of that, we're losing the potential for a silver bullet to really help this industry to pull it out of the bottom of the barrel of perception in the industry, and particularly, I think, unfairly in so many ways, because so much improvement has happened over the last 20 years since so many of those things like equator principles came out. But having said that, I think if we now kind of roll forward, and I think really what came out of that presentation is there was almost an acceptance that the huge mass of global standards out there would continue to be a bit of a mess as to what do people disclose to and how do they disclose to it, and almost that, you know, what you've got to kind of stay with. And it was around 3 months later that I was approached by a number of senior people from that industry, from the fund management industry, to try and come up with a solution which would allow initially the junior miners to apply to that. So we now have a situation where through the Digby frameworks, which is supported by major stakeholders, it's practical for every company. It directly impacts actions taken on the ground and ultimately in the boardroom. It improves efficiency across the board. It challenges but rewards management for the action they take, and provides equally a simple solution for all the third parties to assess in as much or to some extent for some people, as little detail as they wish. Some people just need to know that it's going forward. And so from that position, I'll just walk you through a couple of areas of the solution. And so if you look at what we've got up here on the screen is what we've put together, and it kind of comes into where down the bottom right, related standards, is with the work of Satala and Sarah and her team, we've mapped all the global standards and we've identified the most common ones, and we've tried to effectively make it right-sized and future-looking and appropriate and practical for all companies within this industry. And then to some degree, to break it out on an E, S, and G, it's all intermingled, as you will all know. But in effect, what you've got here is you've got a submission document which is online, which is live with the exploration framework at the moment. You've got questions which relate to the corporate side of it. In this case, this relates to a project where you've got the questions which are identified. You've got the guidance which is given for each different question, which is rationale, as well as the anchor to each and individual one of those standards. And you've got an ability to not only answer, but also to provide a narrative and ultimately to upload some evidence to support that. The idea of this structure is there are about 60 odd questions for exploration, 25 or so of which are within the corporate side of it, and about 45 in the balance of each individual project. And importantly, and particularly for the fund management industry, is that the project questions are split into a context as well as action. As we all know, it's important to make sure that every project is put into the right context, which is not just jurisdiction. It covers a multitude of different areas. The benefits of it not only come into the internal benefits internally, but also ultimately into the external benefits. So the most important benefit right out the start is actually it gives the management the ability to know what to disclose. At the moment, there is this complete confusion as to what do they need to disclose as a result of so many different standards, and most of these standards being written for the producers and not for the non-producers. So first of all, they're given the ability to understand exactly what to disclose, but then also in terms of the output, once they've been through an independent assessment, once they've been able to provide their answers and their evidence, it then goes up to the board of directors for approval. The benefit of that is, of course, as we all know, is that the Paris Accord and many other, and now corporate governance generally, which is moving, as we heard earlier this week, I think it was on Monday, moving from a principles based to a regulatory basis, that the board of directors is now required, or increasingly required, to have an obligation to deal with ESG in many different forms. Once that's gone to a scoring process and comes back with a report, you can see a kind of a bit of a flip shot of it here, is you get not only a score based on the breakdown of the corporate going into the different projects, which also covers the context, but also you get the positives and negatives of the overall score. You get a detailed analysis of it. It can be used for a gap analysis. It can be used for risk management purposes. Most importantly, at the board of directors level, it can be used by compensation committees. I'm chair of a couple of compensation committees. It's impossible to put 20, 30 different topics of ESG into an objective fashion within a compensation scorecard and call it objective. So this is a nice way to effectively address that on an ongoing and standardized basis. Equally, it could be used obviously for risk management, for the audit committee in their risk role. For the external point of view, third parties can get free access to all of this, and they can come onto it, they can have a look at the scores, they can go into as much detail as they like. There's a confidence range around this so they can see where the company is going. And equally, there is then a track record of previous submissions against the current one. So there's a direction of travel. And that's a really important part for the junior miners. I think one of the concerns with ESG, if you are prepared to put yourself out for an assessment, is how do you avoid the potential concern of being marked as a single score? And therefore, we allow these companies to hide for up to a year. The market will know, or anybody going onto it will know that they have done an assessment, but equally, after 13 months, they will then have their score can be released, and there is a direction of travel that comes out from there. I think the other thing, which of course is a great benefit for the main third parties, is that there is an ability to compare and contrast companies and projects on an ongoing basis. You can see down the bottom here, ABC Mining Company and Lorem Ipsum, two very highly well-known companies in the industry. Their scores can effectively come out from that, and you can effectively compare and contrast accordingly to them. Now, I'm just going to go back to my notes because I realized why I couldn't find them. So I think that's the kind of key things I wanted to highlight. But the ability for the mining companies to know what to disclose, or at least to have a framework to what to disclose. There's no charge for that up until the submission moment. So it's an asset which has been put together, knowing that it's a current set of frameworks, or to the guidance which has been put out by multiple different standards in the world. They can send that to the board of directors, where you've got effectively that tick box approach to making sure that that board of directors has done what they needed to do. They understand all the relevant areas of ESG. Something somebody came up with me the other day is it's no longer acceptable for a board of directors to have one person who is approved on the board. You need to have everybody buying into this ESG approach. So they've now got that ability in a plain language and easy to access point of view. And then they've got this this report, which is both online as well as practically internal, which they can use to know their gaps, how to improve, move forward from one year to another. Ultimately, and I think this is where we've got to come back down to, is ultimately, what is the goal of a disclosure process? The goal has got to be that we want to encourage pools of capital that have never got involved in mining to effectively come into this industry. The green money, for instance, that comes in, which is billions and trillions of dollars going over the top of this industry at the moment, has the ability to come into this industry. But they can only do so when they feel comfortable that this industry is addressing some of the issues which it is regarded for. Secondly, they can only come in when they have a credible means to track these companies on a year by year or on a submission by submission basis. So if we're going to encourage these groups to come in, then with that, we basically need to have a credible means which they can have comfort with, which then gives them the ability to then invest in something which is critical to the world's transition to a sustainable future. It's no longer acceptable for mining companies not to do ESG. We know that, but they need to have this ability to track these companies on an ongoing basis. Sarah, I think without probably taking up all of your time, because I know you're a bit tight for time, I'm happy to stop there and ask and have any questions. One thing I didn't mention is the importance of transparency. Transparency, as we all know, from this week particularly, is so important. And I think we're actually seeing an issue with regards to ESG, as we found, Sarah and I have found this week, whereby you've got this new world of transparency coming at the same time as all of these companies have been used to having reps and warranties in their documents. So how do you effectively move the old style way into a new mode of transparency? And I think it's upon us all to understand the importance of transparency, to engage and embrace and effectively allow that to come through, while also acknowledging that we've got a legacy of the legal world, which will no doubt continue, but to effectively allow some form of transition to improve transparency and to relieve some of the pressures that we do have. So I think that covers most of it. Sorry, my notes were a bit off after being so well prepared for 3 days. But maybe I'll leave it to you to ask any questions that you may have.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Jamie. So ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the wonderful Jamie Strauss. Thank you very much. That's great. So Jamie, just with this, I mean, obviously there's benefit for the mining companies, especially those small junior companies who don't have the luxury of having ESG expertise on tap or in-house. So there's lots of benefit for them by showing, okay, these are the kind of things that we expect you to be addressing really early stage, be it an exploration project into development or into operation. But then also there's that benefit with regards to the investors and that world as well. Have you received any endorsement from any of the, be it the investors or the mining companies, or where are you at with that?
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I think this is really important, and it actually covers 2 or 3 angles. So first of all, I was encouraged by the fund managers. It was, in fact, it was BlackRock and Orion, which is the largest private equity group in mining. I was encouraged by them to come up with a solution. So I basically, after looking into this and researching this, it was very clear to me that I went back to them to say, yes, if we do this, I need you to engage. I need you to kind of test. And ultimately, if we've come up with the right solution, to then endorse. And so I happily say that a lot of my time at the end of last year was to effectively bring together at least tier 1 on that. So if you look at the stakeholders we've managed to bring on board, we've got BlackRock, and that's not just the natural resources team, that's the stewardship team, it's the head of research who have been involved in testing, it's Orion, it's the Bank of Montreal, it's Newton Asset Management, Dundee, which many might know in Canada, but maybe not outside of that, Dundee Precious Metals, which is the kind of mining company, but the Goodman family in general in Canada, big mining investors, have bought 5% of Digby and going to make it a precondition for their companies to be involved in, to align to Digby once we've got all the frameworks out. We've gone further than that with now we're working very closely with a lot of the sell side brokers and investment banking firms to make sure that they are on board to try and encourage that into their own client base. But I think maybe I should finish that question by maybe repeating what Evie Hambro came out in an interview we've been asked to present to the G7 in about 3 weeks' time. And Evie Hambro, for those who don't know, heads up the natural resources team at BlackRock and is a huge supporter of ESG, as you would expect with regards to Larry Fink and BlackRock in principle. And he said the concept of ESG for the resources sector isn't a choice. It's absolutely integral to everything that they do. You can't run a mining asset and not think about the environment, about the communities, about how you engage with government, and also how you engage as a business yourself in terms of governance. ESG is essential for any company, but the mining industry has a far greater exposure to the risks that many people see as ESG. So it isn't a choice, it's not a nice to have, it's a necessity. And I think that really sums up from where the fund management industry as a whole, he's not just talking from a BlackRock point of view. I think this is very much a fund management position as a whole, but we need to help them. We need to help this industry as well. We need to help them apply standards which are consistent, which are standardized, which are relatively simple to understand, both from the input as well as the output, and to allow them to therefore measure and contrast companies, and therefore ultimately cost of capital will improve for those companies that are embracing, and cost of capital will effectively worsen for those companies that are not embracing. But equally, we need to help the mining companies effectively give them the information, or at least give them the blueprint to allow them to submit that information going forward.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jamie. There are lots of questions coming in for you at the moment in chat and on the Q&A. But in the interest of time, I'm going to have to move on to our next speakers. But thank you so much for giving us that update on all things Digby. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Ladies and gents, we are getting there in terms of this final session of this week-long conference, and our next two speakers have been hugely influential over the past year. So Jeff and Kirsty, if you guys want to come off mute, and if you have slides or anything like that, now is the right time to share them. So Jeff and Kirsty are the co-founders of the Critical Minerals Association. Now, we heard from the Member of Parliament, Alexander Stafford, yesterday morning, talking about the fact that this time last year, nobody was talking about raw materials or mining or anything like that in the British government, whereas now the conversation is beginning to escalate, and people are beginning to discuss that. And that is greatly due to the wonderful work that Jeff and Kirsty have been up to. So without further ado, please put your hands together for the wonderful Jeff and Kirsty and the Critical Minerals Association. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks to you and Rose for organising another really great conference. It's really impressive to see so many diverse people at these events, so thanks for having us here today. So my name is Kirsty. I'm one of the co-founders of the Critical Minerals Association alongside Jeff, and we set up the Critical Minerals Association just over a year ago after meeting in public affairs and noticing that critical minerals were missing from a lot of UK government publications. So before meeting Jeff, I worked in fundraising, focusing on high net worth individuals, and also had the opportunity to spend some time doing some CSR work on a mine, which was a really great experience for someone without background in earth science or engineering. I'll hand over to Jeff to introduce himself.
Hi there. So I'm Jeff Townsend. My background is in politics, a number of different roles there, whether it's an advisor or spin doctor, multiple shady things. And I was doing communications where I met Kirsty, born on a mine in South Africa, and we recognised that the 10-point plan, or the industrial strategy as it was, lacked some the supply chain to deliver it. So we felt that if we brought the industry together, we'd be onto a winner.
Okay, so the Critical Minerals Association was established with responsible mining at its core. We want to help the supply chain be as socially and environmentally responsible as possible, and we were established to work with industry and academia to generate a collective voice and an avenue for the critical minerals sector to speak to UK government. And this is because critical minerals are at the core of a number of UK government policies. However, when we started, there was little awareness of the importance of these materials in government, as Sarah mentioned earlier. Equally as important as raising awareness of critical minerals in government is improving perceptions in society. So one of our working groups, which is chaired by Lucy Crane and Ben Lepley, is looking into this. And if you haven't heard it, you can hear more about what they're up to at the presentation that they did earlier in the week. So we currently have 17 members, one of which is Satala. So it's great to have people like Sarah, Rose and Aldo on board. Diving into the specific government policies that require critical minerals, when we started in early 2020, the UK's 2017 industrial strategy was an obvious place that critical minerals should fit, but they weren't mentioned, even though 3 of the 4 grand challenges in this industrial strategy, so the future of mobility, the clean growth agenda, artificial intelligence, rely on critical minerals. And over the past year, the UK government has been making increasing green commitments, so replacing the industrial strategy with a 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution. And slowly but surely, we're seeing more government engagement and resources being dedicated to critical mineral supply chains. For example, a couple of months ago, it was really good to see that critical minerals were featuring in the integrated review on security, defence, development and foreign policy. And in addition, the Environmental Audit Select Committee has just put out a request for evidence on electric vehicles and batteries. So that's closing at the end of the month and it's public, so anyone can submit evidence to that. So we believe that ESG should be seen as an opportunity for the UK government. One of these opportunities is how our UK domestic mining industry can use ESG and demonstrate best practice globally. This image shows some of the UK domestic mining opportunities.
So on to me. So if we start looking at how the government determines what it's going to do. Its industrial strategy is very much based around that 10-point plan. So we want to become a government that builds, or a country that builds wind turbines, electric vehicles. And to do that, you need a critical mineral supply chain, as you can see in the middle. But influencing government policy and delivering that are external influences. So finance, ESG rules coming from finance, NGO communities. Many of you will know that the civil society is one of the largest lobby groups in the UK, but internationally as well. And then a number of different things like the legal side of things, the Bribery Act, the ITI. So that's all really important in terms of framing the discussion on ESG, but there's also external political issues. So can you use ESG at a legislative level to level the playing field, whether to promote our own companies or to almost attack other nations' companies and give ourselves a leg up? So there's issues in there that we need to address as well. Kirsty? So I think it's really important. Why do we as the CMA see our unique selling point as our ability to engage with government and influence at a government, both domestically and international level? And I think that's really important that we position ourselves there and we use what we do to try and push the understanding that when mineral extraction is done well, it is one of the key drivers to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'm sure you've seen these pictures a lot over the last week. I'm hoping that you have. You know, and if you look at the ICMM graph in the bottom right, you can see that wherever mining dependent nations they are reaching, predominantly they are reaching the Sustainable Development Goals quicker. So I think that's a really important understanding that why are we doing ESG? We're doing ESG because we want to make the world a better place, but we also see that mining and mineral extraction is key to achieving that in some of the developing nations where mining is very, very important. There's many people who have been involved in this conference who are positioned well to deliver ESG thinking through finance, through NGOs at an industry level. Where we sit is our ability to engage with governments and trying to influence governments. So when they do take this on as a legislative agenda, we are able to ensure that they're taking the right decisions, not the easy decision. Kirsty? So we've done that in a number of different ways. So the first one is we provide the secretariat to the all-party parliamentary group on critical minerals. An APPG is a group of cross-party politicians in Parliament, and they look at specific issues, in this case, critical minerals. We've done a number of different events so far, but probably the most important one that we've done on ESG is, Kirsty, we did one on the tailing standards, and we were really lucky to have the Church of England and ICMM, Global Tailings Review, come and speak about the key issues and how that was built and why it's such an important step in mineral extraction kind of issues as we drive, and we see that finance is now taking its ability and its importance within the sector to actually influence the way that the industry operates. So we use the APPG as a mechanism where the politicians can ask, we're interested in ESG, we're interested in circular economy, and we can find the right people to speak and give the right kind of views on that. Kirsty? With the help of Satala, predominantly Satala, we did an excellent introduction to mining for MP researchers and civil servants. So we had 30 people attend that, and that was from extraction all the way through to the role in government and what government can play in terms of trying to change legislative positions on impacts and issues around the mining sector. And that's really important and was really successful. So over the last month and a half, I've had civil servants from Angola, Malawi, Zambia, South Africa phone me up from the DIT teams there, Department for International Trade teams there, and they were all part of that training session. So you can see the reach that this has had and the importance it has in trying to understand and facilitate that understanding of the mineral extraction sector and the role that ESG plays in ensuring that it is done properly. Kirsten? And then we get to some of the other work that we're doing. So at the moment, the UK, as you know, will play host to both the G7 and COP26. So critical minerals are taking a really central role at the G7. That could be highlighted by the fact that South Korea and Australia are both being invited to attend, even though they're not members of the G7. And also at COP26, we understand that critical minerals and the supply chains will be discussed there in quite some detail. Although discussions whether that goes virtual now or not may change that. But we wanted to use our ability to engage with MPs like Alexander Stafford, who is the vice chair of the APPG Critical Minerals. And I used to work on the same corridor as him about 10 years ago. He's terrible at corridor cricket. He's a very good man otherwise. And we use our ability to engage and to take experts from the industry into Parliament to influence that. And that's really important because the messages that go into Parliament, into Whitehall now, will be used in shaping the G7 and the COP26 throughout the year. And the big piece of work that we're doing at the moment is we're doing a very big paper, which Kirsty and Olympia at the CMA, as well as Aldo from Satala, are helping to drive. And we're calling on all of our members who have been excellent in providing evidence and information and case studies. So we're really proud of that piece of work as it's coming along, and that will play a significant role in ensuring that the message around ESG and the importance of it as we go forwards is taken into there, where at an international level there is a call now for standardized ESG rules. And that's important. Just finishing then, that's important because we're doing ESG because we want to make the world the right place, but you can do ESG easily. So things like banning all cobalt from the DRC, but I don't think that's the right way to go. I think if you go back to the role mining has in development, a country like the DRC, mining and the extraction of cobalt is an incredibly important part. So we need to make sure that when governments and international bodies take the right decisions or take decisions on ESG, they take the right decisions, not the easy decisions. And that's where we hope the CMA plays a significant role. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Jeff and Kirsty. Absolutely brilliant. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Jeff and Kirsty and the CMA. Brilliant. So just with regards to this, there are a number of questions that have come in, but the first one I'm going to call out is Jeff, you dumped yourself in it at the beginning with your British sense of sarcastic humour, where you said that you were spin doctoring on multiple shady areas. Do you want to just clarify that for our global audience and tell them that is not what you're doing?
Not what I'm doing now, no. Look, I wasn't smart enough to go into mining, so I went into politics, is the basis of it. And I had a number of different roles, whether it's in South Africa or Washington, DC or the UK, predominantly as an advisor on foreign affairs and international development. And I was also a chief of staff to an MP or a minister. And then I turned from gamekeeper into poacher and became a lobbyist for a few years. It pays better. But then with a background in mining and being born on a mine in South Africa and growing up in mining communities, I think it's really important that as the world transitions from petroleum through to critical minerals and renewable energy, that actually there is a voice in those political corridors that understands and is able to influence and ensure that decision makers are making the right decisions and making informed decisions, not easy decisions.
Thanks for that, Jeff. In terms of, I mean, obviously the CMA is very new, and it's great to see every month there are new members joining it and really clubbing together to use that avenue to work with the British government. Now, of course, this is just a UK case study, but it's not to say that you can't have similar setups elsewhere in the world. Have you seen similar organisations to CMA interacting with other governments?
Yes, well, so the CMA actually is constantly engaged with the Australian government and the Canadian government, and we also have partner or sister associations in both of those nations as well. And there's very much a view in the UK at least that critical minerals will start to take a Five Eyes approach. Now, America is going to be a net importer, so you can part them to one side. And New Zealand is very important, but is more is directing towards China. So actually that leaves you three nations, and that's Canada, Australia, and the UK. And then the surrounding satellite nations of that would be the EU, Japan, South Korea. So I think that's really where there's going to be a real focus on trying to create international standards around ESG that work across those nations. And there's a lot of collaboration. There's a lot of associations out there doing similar work. And we're trying to make sure the message is the same across all those nations.
Brilliant. So that consistency of messaging, ideally that consistency of thought, which will, going back to Alexander Stafford's talk that he gave yesterday morning, actually ensuring that we can get that trade to flow between those different nations. Fantastic. And I think just last comment from my end, I'm so glad that that training course seems to have had such an impact. I'm looking at Rose and the rest of the team. Perhaps we need to run another one if that's what's sparked some of the discussion. And I think on behalf of Responsible Raw Materials, we'd be more than happy to do that if it helps the discussion and the knowledge. Brilliant. So ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the fantastic Jeff and Kirsty. Brilliant. Thank you very much, guys. And that now takes us to our final talk of the entire conference. So this will be talk number 73. So no pressure, Dr. Smith. So just while Dan shares his slides. Okay. Oh dear, it is definitely got to be the end of the week. I have lost the ability to speak. So Dan is going to talk to us about common ground in sustainability, some hot topics. As you can see, he's from the University of Leicester, which, by the way, happens to be where Rose is doing her PhD at the moment. So big shout out to Leicester. But ladies and gents, please put your hands together for the fantastic Dan Smith. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah and Rose, for running this event with the team at Satala, and thanks to all the other speakers. So I'm going to come trampling in with my Doc Martens and try and pull some stuff together. And I think with some of what I'm going to talk about, I'm very much going to be preaching to the converted here, because this is an event that, you know, we've had talks all week really that cover a lot of the different bases of what we're interested in the mining sector. And there are lots of hot topics. And the reason I've split these out into different hot topics is that it's quite easy and conceivable, and you can evidence this yourself with a quick Google search, that you could have a different conference on each of these, and you could easily fill 2 days of people talking just about one of these topics. And this Responsible Reserves event, the second one that we've had now, this big annual conference, we've kind of pulled together people talking across these topics. I think for those of us that are inside this mining bubble, and those people that Jeff and Kirsty and the colleagues at Satala are doing such a good job at sort of trying to indoctrinate or initiate into that mining bubble as well, they understand that these things are interconnected and you can't look at them in isolation. But we very much, as Jeff set me up so well for this, we're very much entering this age where policymakers, particularly in the UK, are now looking at this thinking, oh, we've got to do something here. And the risk is that if you look at these problems in isolation, you end up with if you look at the problems too simply, you end up with solutions that are too simple and don't work. So if you want to respond to security of supply and geopolitics, there's a simple answer: we need more mining. If you're worried about the legacy of mining and the safety of tailings, then the answer is simple: you need fewer mines. We end up cancelling ourselves out. If we want, Jeff mentioned this one specifically, if we want more cobalt, the obvious thing to do is to go and explore in the DRC. If you really want to you can't be bothered to figure out the legal and ethical issues and figure out a way of operating in the DRC in a better fashion, then you don't mine in the DRC. We end up with very simple solutions that we're not considering holistically. And we essentially end up running the risk of playing whack-a-mole, particularly in terms of some of our policy or perhaps our investment decisions. So what I want to focus on is a few key areas where actually a concerted effort on a toolkit or a process or a concept actually ticks multiple boxes across many problems. So the first one is one for the geoscientists among us. So full disclosure, my background is that I'm an academic, but an economic geologist. I'm interested in boring chemical element ratios that have, to most people, no significance towards gold or copper, but I'm interested in the fundamental geoscience of ore deposits and how we discover them. So this is a technical problem for me and my colleagues in exploration and fundamental geoscience. And that problem is that our quality of deposits is declining around the world. So I'm going to share some data from Gavin Mudd's compilation from 2010. This is just looking at Australian deposits of various different classes: copper, gold, diamonds, uranium. But the same is true globally, and it's the same across all metals. Our grade is declining, and as our grade declines, clearly per unit metal, we end up with more units of waste. As our grade declines, the amount of water that we need to consume to produce our unit of metal increases. Our energy use increases. So much of our fundamental, certainly environmental footprint, but also in terms of some of our social footprint, in terms of competition for water, the production of waste and legacy at the surface, is inherently linked to the fundamental geology of a deposit and its quality, particularly its grade. So one area that we can concentrate on, and this is primarily a problem for the geoscientists to discover high quality deposits with a good grade, is to find those deposits. The issue for investors is to look further and deeper into net present values and understand that when we value a deposit, we're multiplying our grade by our tonnage, but really the important figure to look at is grade. This has been a traditional mantra that grade is king in the ore deposits community, typically when metal prices aren't so good and you want to reduce costs. I think we need to be doing this constantly, not just in boom times, because as we've seen from some of the other problems, the green transition, increasing demand for metals, etc., we could well be looking at a boom time in the commodities super cycle. So tonnage might well be flattering, whereas grade is really what solves or reduces some of our problems. If we cannot improve the grade of our deposit, then the other way that we can reduce the intensity of our energy, water and waste per unit metal produced is actually to produce more metals. So this is a concept, I don't think it's got a formal name, hence the quote marks around efficiency. I don't think there's any consensus on what we really call this, but for a long time we've recognized that our major industrial metals, the center of that wheel on the left there, have associated with them because of their geoscience and their geochemistry, various other metals, some of which can be economically produced and are at present, those in the sky blue color, and others that have potential, but we rarely exploit. And we tend to refer to these as the byproducts. So those are the ones in the white wheel. Jeff and his colleagues at the Critical Metals Association might well recognize some of those elements. They tend to be our critical metals. And actually in the 20th century, we've done a really poor job of extracting that diversity, that family of byproduct metals from our ore. So on the right, I show a plot of byproduct intensity of tellurium, which is a metal essential for certain classes of photovoltaic panel. And you can show its consistent decline in production relative to copper production. So for every unit copper, we actually produce less tellurium as we've gone from the 60s into the early 21st century. the data blocked out for the last couple of decades to protect some commercially sensitive operations in the US. But nevertheless, the trend is pretty stark from 1960 onwards that we're not very efficient with how we mine and how many metals we take out of the ground. A second aspect that I think would improve lots of our lives, I speak as a member of this conference and people that are interested in mining and ESG, is a better understanding exactly of what goes on in supply chains. So this complex figure on the right shows the number of nodes, companies, mines, smelters, refiners that are represented typically in the production of a cadmium telluride photovoltaic panel. So really complicated, multiple nodes, multiple pathways, and many of those will represent a change in country and nationality as well. So international trade and shipping of material. And on one of the things that as people within the mining bubble, we don't tend to communicate very well to people outside it, is that most mines don't actually produce metal. They produce concentrates and then they send them to a smelter. Smelters don't actually produce metals. They produce not saleable metals, they produce raw metals or impure metals that go on to refineries, and they're the ones that produce the metals. The refineries produce some metals apparently from nothing by reprocessing primarily of wastes, but those wastes might be shipped internationally under categories that define them by what they are not. So they might be shipped internationally as residues from copper processing, which means they contain very little copper, and the economic value in them and the purpose for their shipping, partially to remove the waste liabilities from the selling company, but partially for the buying company to exploit them for a suite of those byproduct metals. And this becomes very inscrutable. It becomes very multinational. But what does this do to those of us that are facing ESG? We've had some talks this week, and including from Louis from the OECD, about scrutiny and forensics of these supply chains, due diligence as he termed it, and it was key to ethics and understanding things like corruption in supply chains. But fundamentally, the opacity and the lack of transparency in these supply chains, whether that's intentional or not, and the lack of robust data about them in terms of the international trade means that we can't really work out ESG footprints by the time we get to a government that wants to make strategic plans about their ESG footprints, or to consumers that want to buy material that's informed. Much of our reporting on each of these nodes here will be very much pointed towards the investors in those companies, not in terms of passing that information along to the final consumer. And there are some issues here. One is that a lot of sustainability reporting in ESG, if you're a company that operates two mines, there is a tendency to aggregate those two mines together. Therefore, it makes the footprint, life cycle analysis, etc., very difficult to do. If you are a smelter that accepts concentrates from multiple different mines and operations, there's a tendency to homogenize that information together. So again, the traceability is lost. Shipping codes I've already mentioned in terms of how wastes are classified. And then I think probably our single largest barrier here is this data has some inherent value to all of these companies on each of these supply chains. It's commercially sensitive, but the lack of transparency means that when we have those end consumers that are wanting to buy or even build or assemble that final cadmium telluride photovoltaic panel, they've got a real challenge in getting that data. We tend to move this data, we receive it from the node previous to us and we pass it on to the node after us. But in terms of linking it up, it's really quite difficult. Finally, I want to talk about climate change. So I said I wouldn't. I said I wanted to talk across the topics rather than focus on one, but I'm going to whack this mole. Climate change is possibly the hottest of the hot topics. It's the one that has the most international action, the most international coordination so far. It's the one that has perhaps received the most attention in the various standards that the mining industry now has to deal with. And mining has a strange relationship with climate change. It's both a risk and an opportunity. It's mining is both a cause of and a solution to some of our carbon emission problems. And there are colleagues around the world. This is an excellent paper by Geordie Lee. I recommend you take a look at it, released last year. He was looking really at how well sustainability reporting lets us review mining in the context of its ESG footprint. And strictly speaking, this isn't the way we should use GRI reporting. We shouldn't use them to compare different companies. They're apples and oranges. But in the absence of any other tools, this is what we've got. What he found was that particularly for scope 3 emissions, it was incredibly variable how mining companies did it. They had different methods. They reported to different categories. And some of this, I think we have to acknowledge that it's their ability to track downstream in supply chains too, to find out how their products are used. Is it going to be a real limitation on calculating scope 3 emissions in particular? They have different methodologies. So the plot on the right shows Freeport's emissions in various categories. If we just look at the top 2 rows, the total greenhouse gas emissions, that's Freeport in 2017 and 2018 using BHP's method for calculating emissions. And the second line down is Freeport's emissions in 2017 and 2018 calculated using Freeport's method. So Freeport's method saves them about 60% of their total emissions. So we need some standardization of standards. These are all using the greenhouse gas protocols. They're all using GRI reporting, but there's flexibility afforded to them because those tools are not specific to mining and are designed to accommodate all the different needs of miners, and they can result in these different outcomes. So sustainability reporting has some limitations. But there are new schemes coming through which don't measure scope 3 emissions, scope 2 emissions. They're not interested in CO2. They're interested in the bottom line. So TCFD, looking at what the financial consequences of climate change are. And again, mining has a strange relationship with it. With TCFD, a lot of mining companies see it as both an opportunity and a problem. This is from Barrick's report, really interesting analysis here. And it doesn't really matter whether they go for business as usual, so the stated policy scenario on the left, or a sustainable development scenario where they more aggressively adopt renewable power and predict much more drastic curtailing of carbon emissions and fossil fuel use. Either way has a financial impact in terms of higher costs. And if you look at the World Gold Council's analysis of climate change on the finances, it also has a positive outcome in that as world markets wobble, gold returns to being the safe haven for investors. So gold miners come out okay. What's pretty clear if you look at these numbers, though, is that the only way to reduce these costs, switching to renewable doesn't really reduce your costs. It just shifts it to a capital expense from an operating expense. If you really want to save some money, then it's in terms of efficiency. And I pick on efficiency because there's been some interesting analysis done of sustainability reporting to indicate that perhaps mining companies haven't become that much more efficient. So Michel Levesque, an interesting study published in 2014, looking at the Canadian mining sector, looking at how they'd innovated, developed modes of new efficiency in mining operations and how they'd spread through the industry. What was their uptake? What was their adoption rate? Not brilliant in terms of the narrative in those reports. So lots of independent innovations, but very little dissemination of it through the whole sector. What we can see on the plot on the left is that the energy intensity per ton of ore has remained flat over time. And the interpretation of that was that there were very little efficiency improvements. It's actually really difficult with mining to say that. Going back to the quality of the deposits, a mine is a strange project in that it deteriorates over time. The more work you do, the worse it gets because of your depletion of the highest quality parts of your reserve. So flat over time, despite declining grades, actually disguises a lot of continuous improvements and mine site efficiencies in the sector. So perhaps the TCFD offers us an opportunity not to look at the mining sector in terms of its CO2 emissions and disguising what efficiency gains it makes, but in terms of disclosing cost benefit analyses and have they been realized? How much cost has been saved by these efficiency processes? So what we're seeing here are gaps in the sustainability reporting that don't necessarily suit the mining sector, but perhaps there is potential in these tools, and perhaps translating some of our ESG footprints into those financial terms. They won't instantly have the financial effect that we want, because the underlying credentials of the mining industry mean that they will probably stand to do quite well out of our low carbon future. But perhaps looking at some of their metrics in financial terms will encourage them to adopt more aggressively and more collectively efficiency improvements and ESG improvements more sector-wide, that the traditional scientific measures of water intensity, energy use and emissions have not really resulted in that same uptake of ideas. So to wrap up, the mining sector is subject to these really diverse pulls. And as policymakers enter the fray with certification, with procurement laws, with standards, with market access, we have to message to them that the problems cannot be solved in isolation. We cannot play whack-a-mole with these problems. There are some cross-cutting challenges and solutions that are broadly applicable. The quality of ore deposits is a huge part of its ESG footprint, and our measures of quality need to adapt to take on more factors that measure, particularly, I would say, the social problems. I've spoken with a little bit more focus on the environmental footprint rather than the social footprint. But simply turning these into financial measures where multiplying by lots of tons is not going to be the toolkit that we want. We need metal inventories and trade data as this essential scaffolding, framework or skeleton on which we hang ESG. If our ESG is to be consumer facing, strategically useful for policymakers, rather than just to the investors in those companies, then the transparency needs to be cascaded, and that data needs to be cascaded through the entire supply chain. Mining is a special case in ESG. We need appropriate tools. Corporate sustainability reporting is definitely leaving gaps. And then finally, the treatment of climate change and other ESG indicators in financial terms might actually lead to some positive consequences and better evidence for change. But simply asking the mining industry to consider climate change in financial terms, they basically balance out what the higher costs are. Let's say, for example, the deterioration of coal portfolios in the majors with uptick in the final sale of the product in terms of things like copper. So it's in terms of what's ticking away under the hood financially that's going to be really interesting in the next few years as things like TCFD really spread out. And that's me. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Dan. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together from the other side of your muted microphones and say thank you very much to Dan Smith. Brilliant. So what I'm going to invite everybody to do is for our panelists to gently turn on their videos if they're still around. I know some people have had to drop off to go and deal with family stuff, other work stuff, etc., which is great. Dan, just before I pose a question to the whole panel, and by the way, the question is going to be, if there is one tool that helps us to actually make ESG a bit more of a reality within the entire raw materials space, what do you suggest it is? So panelists, that is the question that I'm going to come to you on. But just while everybody's thinking about that, Dan, there's a question here from a certain Richard Harrington, who's also on the panel in the chat. And Richard asks, surely simple grade, and so that is basically the concentration of how much metal might be in a rock. So surely simple grade, as by the way, I wasn't telling Dan that. Dan knows exactly what grade is. That was for the benefit of people who might not be geoscientists or entrenched within the mining sector. I'll try again. Dan, surely simple grade is not the whole story with regards to quality. Changing and lower carbon technologies may force a switch to different ore types, and so it's a link between grade and cost of recovery. And so what do you think with regards to that?
Yeah, so I tried to couch it in terms of the quality of the ore deposit in terms of my overall header, and at the minute our axis of quality is on grade primarily. I think you're right. Perhaps as we switch to things like renewable power, we change the ability to deliver certain processes in the mining sector just because of the nature of that demand. So units of energy become relatively cheap, but things like high temperature processes become very expensive. So generating very high temperatures is really quite affordable with fossil fuels, really quite difficult with pure electric and renewable sources, unless you can do something like concentrating solar. So I think we need to be alive to what the axes of quality on an ore deposit will be in the future. But I think what's happened in the latter part of the 20th century is, particularly particularly the first few years of the 21st century as well, is that low-grade deposits became very appealing because we were dealing with bulk tonnage processes, economies of scale were kicking in, and we were multiplying very small grades by very big numbers of tonnages to arrive back at what looked like very competitive net present values. And I think we are now living with some of the ESG consequences of those bulk tonnage open pits in terms of their environmental legacies, their footprints, their energy consumption per unit ore. So I think grade is important right now, but perhaps a better way of phrasing it is that be careful that you're not just taking bad numbers and multiplying them by really big tonnages, because I think that axis of quality, I think, is leading us a little bit astray on this. So you're absolutely right. Grade isn't everything, but it's certainly part of it.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, taking bad numbers and multiplying them by big numbers doesn't always give us a nice answer. So brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Dan. I'm just going to open up the panel as a whole. But yes, thank you very much, Jamie. Dan, another massive round of applause. Thank you so much for bringing to bear some of those brilliant hot topics. Fantastic. So what we're going to do now is going back to that question that I posed. So the question being, if there is one ESG tool, technique, approach that you think could make a really big difference with regards to responsible raw materials. So that could be mining, it could be processing, it could be responsible sourcing, it could be the investing and the financing, the insuring, it could be governments, it could be any of those stakeholders. What do you think that tool might be? And just to give you a little bit of inspiration, in case you guys haven't seen it enough during the course of the conference, just to remind you of our little infographic that we've been working around during the course of the last 5 days, 8 sessions. And within here, we have a whole myriad of different tools and techniques that come from very, very different angles and from disciplines and specialists who, in some cases, they might speak to all of us, and in other cases, we might never have realized that they even existed. So part of the purpose of this conference has really been to try and inspire collaboration, hopefully with an effort of, let's going into the big word of the conference, which is co-creation. So how do we work together to actually ascertain how do we make responsible raw materials a reality? So for our panelists, if you're thinking, oh help, what on earth am I going to go with? Hopefully something in one of the white speech bubbles here should be able to inspire you. if you're wondering where it is, it's on the website at www.responsiblerawmaterials.com. I'm going to stop sharing now. This is a little bit like a memory game, isn't it, potentially? And I'm going to come to, because Richard asked that question of Dan, I'm going to come to Richard Harrington first. So Richard, from your perspective, what ESG tool do you think either is or could be really, really impactful in terms of making ESG a reality? And after Richard, I'm going to go to Jamie.
Actually, I'm going to be a bit controversial and raise something that's not on your, I'm going to add something to your diagram.
Please do, by the way. So people have been suggesting things during the week, and we are doing an updated version after the conference. So yes, if there's stuff that we're missing, yes, please, please, please tell us what it is. So Richard.
Well, it's great. I mean, and you've got Via's great presentation about, you know, measuring the environment, and you've got a lovely picture of him measuring the tools downstream. What you don't have is the measurement of nature, of what nature was before we get going. And I think that ought to be on there. You've obviously got the impact of the communities and so on, but nature out there doesn't seem to have a voice on your diagram at the moment. You've got you could monitor it, but we need to let nature speak first and then work to it. So that would be my big thing, is to develop a metric for nature that is able to be used in the ESG. So it'll add to the E, and it will give you a number for the bio part of the E.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Richard. Jamie, I'm coming to you next, and then I'm going to go to Dan.
Okay, if co-creation is the key word there, then as much as I respect that finance has not always been well regarded across all different subsets of the world, finance is now collaborating to make sure that the efforts of so many different parts of ESG actually come together. And if you look at the mining space, the large producing companies require the world, and their drive is to get a better value for their shareholders, ultimately from a value perspective. But at the same time, the juniors or the non-producers require the capital markets to exist, let alone to do what they're doing. So if we accept that as a principle, then the collaboration of finance or the capital markets, and that very much includes insurance as well. I was talking earlier this week with regards to a major underwriter in the industry, the ability to simplify or to bring together all of these different areas of ESG in a simple way that everybody can effectively disclose on a standardized basis, to encourage management and reward management for the actions that they take, will allow improved valuations, new pools of capital, better risk, better pricing of risk with regards to insurance, better capacity in the insurance market for these sort of things. And that brings everything, almost every single topic you've had this week, forward and move forward. So everybody's little bit is important, but if finance is the collaborator of it all, then simplicity, standardization is the most important thing to go forward.
Great. Thank you for that, Jamie. Fantastic. Dan, let's come to yourself next, and then we'll go to Kirsty.
I was going to respond to Richard actually, and his comment about, you know, being able to measure nature and the baseline. And, you know, baseline surveys and environmental impact assessment are bread and butter. The key is expressing those in numbers that mean something to decision makers. And for a long time we've had this concept of the valuation of natural capital, and I guess the latest big splash in that was the Dasgupta report. So if people aren't familiar with that, that's a report on biodiversity, but it's commissioned by the UK Treasury. So it's really focusing on biodiversity and nature and wilderness, but through the prism of finance and dollars and cents and pounds and pence. And I think one of the issues that I have with this, one of my concerns, is that with the valuation of natural capital, is that you end up with a very simple cost benefit analysis of whether a project might proceed or not. One of my concerns is that it's very difficult to turn some of the fundamental and inherent value that humans place on nature, and that nature places on itself in terms of ecosystem services, it's quite difficult to do that. And if we end up totting it up and it turns out that our gold mine is just worth more, then that might be a very simple decision to make for policymakers, that one is worth more than the other. And I'm just concerned that our attempts at the valuation of natural capital are in their infancy, and might always be in their infancy. These are intangible things that we're trying to turn into finance, but that turning them into simple metrics that makes for simple decisions, which might be wrong. So my concern, I agree we need to be able to do it, but it's how we use it, Richard.
I'm just rather than let this descend, or sorry, elevate into a beautiful debate, I'm just going to carry on around the panel, and there's nothing stopping us from carrying on afterwards. I'm just aware that some people are probably going to have to leave us in about 13 minutes time. But thank you very much for that, Dan. Kirsty, let's come on to yourself, and then we'll go to Veer.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to go for a bit of a cop-out because I looked at that infographic and I think all of them are important, but equally listening to one of the talks yesterday, I mean, I think you have to address all of them in some way. You can't necessarily miss one of them, otherwise that risks things being missed. But I was struck by one of the comments that Peter Bryant made on one of the talks about two things that need to be considered when they were setting up accounting standards, which were auditing and also being able to compare different standards. So I think that would be really helpful if those things were happening. But yeah, to conclude, I think I'm going to agree with what Jamie was saying. If we could just simplify ESG, that would be massive help for all different stakeholders.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Kirsty. And Amanda has just put into the Q&A that she also agrees with Jamie. So Jamie, you're getting lots of votes at the moment, and I'm sure we all agree with Richard and Dan as well, just to make that really clear. Veer, let's come to your lovely self, and then we'll go to Gareth.
Sure. I think as an ecologist, but also active in this mining space, for me, the big thing is the environmental data. And I think we have to recognize that we've had a major measurement problem up until now. We haven't been able to measure biodiversity properly, or it's been very limited in its scope. And I think the opportunity now to use tools to generate big data, which we can now put into machine learning, we can do predictive modeling. I think this is huge. And I think this will really revolutionize the way that biodiversity data is being looked at, specifically when we can now engage with things like satellites, imagery, and all the other wonderful tools that are coming to light. But I do really echo what Jamie's saying, because I think that ultimately it's going to come down to the financiers and the metrics that they use to gauge these projects. I think now the real challenge is taking these tools and feeding them into the correct metrics that the financiers and everyone else can use and look at, and simplifying them. And I think it's a very exciting space, and it's what we're doing right now, is trying to do that. So that's a positive. And I also think that you could address this in consortia and do this as a co-production, do this together, share the ideas, even the companies within the mining sector, share those ideas. Don't do this in isolation. I think that was a thing that I could echo as well. That came up in one of the talks by Dan, I think. So yeah, very exciting. That's where I think big changes could come, and especially when you can start engaging communities in that measurement. I think that is now addressing another part of the ESG.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Veer. Brilliant. Gareth, let's come to yourself, and then we'll go to Francesca. Oh, Gareth, have you got the mute button? If not, we're going to go straight to Francesca, and then we'll try Gareth again.
Okay, so from my perspective, so on the ground perspective, I think an easy but also challenging tool, but it would be quite helpful, is to have publicly available ESIAs with clear mention to the risk registers. I think that creates a completely different level of trust and visibility of what mining companies are doing in terms of impact assessment and community development and managing risks. And that allows for everybody to have that kind of transparency, and also having all the stakeholder participating, not just to the identification of the problems, but also the solutions. So I think it's that
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Francesca. I totally agree. Gareth, let's try your mute now, and then we'll finish off with Ludovine.
Hi there. Sorry, I think my internet, you all went in slow motion. So but I think it's back to normal speed now. So we had hyper speed and then down to slow motion, haven't we, today? So yeah, to answer, I think I echo Veer and perhaps Jamie and others at other ends. I think to answer simply, observations, true independent observations and measurements, however they are achieved, and then they have to be boiled down to simple metrics to be usable. But to elaborate a bit further, to take emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, like satellites can't do that by themselves. They can't. It's not a solution in themselves. They're a part of a solution. So you have to blend that and calibrate that with ground data in select locations, but each has its limitations. Ground measurements are local. Satellites have a global view. Together we can piece together the whole picture, and that's what we need to do. And then we need to be able to simplify that into things that are reported well and in a digestible way.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Gareth. And just to finish off, Ludovine.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to be honest, I'm going to come back to one of the points I made earlier this week, is that I think in the midst of this complexity, and not to add fire to the controversy, but none of these stakeholders are a single thing. Finance is just a huge collection of savings of billions of people. And so, governments are just the expression of policy choices by millions of voters. And so I think considering the fact that each of these stakeholders actually not only impacts the others, but is the others, can perhaps facilitate the balancing act between all of these varied interests. I like Jamie's proposal that finance can be, the point of coalescence of these interests. I think every single stakeholder should try to coalesce interests, because there can be no single winner if all of these stakeholders don't actually together align around a collective interest. And I know that sounds very fluffy, but in terms of decision making, it also means, systematically placing interest in balance with others. And that's can come down to some hard choices, but I think we need to start making them.
Brilliant. No, thank you very, very much for that, Ludovine. And I think just in an attempt to try and summarize what we have just heard, but then also what we've been hearing throughout the week, and to go back to our infographic, which, yes, please do tell us what we are missing. We always knew we would be missing lots on this. And this is almost, to use Ludovine's words, this is the coalescence or an attempt at it to say, okay, what can we be doing collectively, bearing in mind we all have different perspectives. We all have different desires and wants. We all have slightly different things that are perhaps important to us as well. But perhaps the simplicity in ESG, it is absolutely not trying to make all of those standards, frameworks, etc., more generic, because actually that makes things more complex. So it's not making things generic. It's perhaps saying, no, out of all of that, what is the stuff that is actually really important? The stuff that creates impact and action and change. One way, and we certainly found this within Jamie's Digby tool, is how do you get some of those standards that might be 300 questions long down to something that is more palatable? You look at those questions that ask about change and impact, rather than asking if somebody has a policy, etc. Because there's no point in having a policy unless you actually use it. There's no point in measuring something unless you do something with that data, for example. So perhaps that is one of the avenues into that simplicity, as perhaps many of us have been calling for as well. And to come on to that central point around finance, having spent all of my career working in this space, if you are the geologist standing there in the field, you can jump up and down and talk about ESG and you can make it a reality. But unless you've got people like the government, like the financiers, etc., also pushing in the same direction, it gets really difficult, because to be honest, you lose your job because you're not going to be rewarded for doing that good stuff. And so this is a case here where what we're trying to do is pull all of that together. So in summary, ladies and gentlemen, in our last few minutes before we wrap up, yes, this has been the Responsible Raw Materials Annual Conference from 2021. This time last year, we were just about finishing a conference that we pulled together. I mean, this was Rose's internship project last year. So a massive thank you to Dan for introducing Rose to ourselves. And Rose, if you're there, please do turn on your camera in a second. So Rose is the person behind this. She is the one who's managed to pull this off. The reason why we did this conference this year is because so many of you reached out and said, when are you doing the next conference? What have we managed to achieve? Well, we've had people from all over the world dialing in and listening to everything that's been going on, engaging in discussion, engaging in debate and challenge. So 5 days, 8 sessions, 73 talks, 81 speakers, well over 500 attendees. We've had lots and lots of people dialing in to watch talks on YouTube after they have been delivered live. And also, as previously mentioned, a massive congratulations to the team behind the scenes for taking all of those talks, adding them into the abstracts within 24 hours of those talks being given. So what it means is that we now on the platform, having started from nothing just over a year ago, we've got well over 150 talks, all of which are 10 to 30 minutes long. So they're short and sweet, delivered by the world experts on a whole wide variety of different aspects of sustainability and responsibility within raw materials. So what does this mean? What comes next? Well, we, of course, are really delighted to hear all of your ideas, and it's great to see, I think Jane Wardy put a suggestion in on the chat of people that we should be reaching out to and engaging with and making this resource that everybody has put together available, or making people aware of this collation of tools, tips and techniques. That's what we want to do. We want to increase that awareness and ultimately make ESG a reality in this space. It is not a nice to have, it is essential. We all need these minerals and metals, but there is very little point in trying to go for our energy transition or anything else unless we actually have a net benefit at the end of the day. And that's a net benefit to nature. To use Richard's insight there, it's a net benefit to the communities, such as those that Francesca was talking about, to our governments and everybody else, ourselves as well. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, a massive, massive thank you to our speakers from today, but also our 81 speakers from the past week. And of course, our wonderful organising group behind the scenes. You've done a phenomenal job. Thank you very much. Round of applause.
Sarah, I'm sure from all of us, many, many thanks to you and all of your team.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jamie. It means a huge amount. And yeah, so please do feel free to disappear off. Enjoy the rest of your Fridays, wherever you happen to be around the world. If anybody does want to stick around for a few minutes after this, if you've got ideas of what we should be doing with responsible raw materials next, we do welcome all of your ideas and insight. Or if you can't stick around, feel free to drop us an email at hello@responsiblerawmaterials.com, and you will get Rose or myself on the other end of that. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a good weekend.
Thanks, Sarah. That was really good. I'm writing up the little blog, and I'll try and have it online by this afternoon, okay?
Amazing. Thanks very much, Ludovine. That's great.
Thanks, ladies. I'll talk to you later. And gentlemen, sorry, I was not excluding you. Bye.
Thanks
Cool.
all.
Thanks very much. Cheers. Cool. Sorry, Richard, I didn't mean to cut off that wonderful discussion that was about to blossom between Dan and yourself, but I could just see the time kind of go.
No, we would have got into the Das Gupta report, which wouldn't have been a healthy thing to be doing.
It would have been a very, very long and complicated agreement, I think, wouldn't it, Richard?
Well, it would. We would have ended up agreeing at the end, and we